Thank you, President. We apologize deeply for these technical difficulties. Can you hear me?
You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, Madam Minister of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Rwanda, and other distinguished ambassadors and representatives. Thank you for convening an emergency meeting of the Security Council to follow up on the situation in Goma. Allow me to share with you our understanding of the current situation and the implications for MONUSCO. The escalating clashes in Eastern DRC have resulted in massive displacement. More than 178,000 people fled Kalehe territory when the M23 took over Minova, with more than 34,000 of them seeking refuge in already overcrowded existing IDP sites in and around Goma. This surge has exacerbated an already dire humanitarian situation and also a protection situation, overwhelming Goma's infrastructure and compounding challenges related to water, electricity, and medical services. Despite the deliberations and the appeal by member states at the Emergency Security Council meeting on 26 January, the M23 RDF launched an attack on Goma using heavy direct and indirect fire within hours after the conclusion of the Security Council meeting. These attacks continue to ravage the city, killing, injuring, traumatizing, and displacing civilians and exacerbating the crisis. In accordance with its obligations under international humanitarian law, during the last few days, MONUSCO has received a large number of people seeking refuge, including officials and various elements who have surrendered their arms, which underscores once again the critical role of peacekeeping in such a volatile environment. The mission's human rights component also continues to receive requests for individual protection measures from human rights defenders and civil society organizations, and is working internally and with external partners to ensure their safety. However, MONUSCO's bases are not able to accommodate the large number of surrendering elements and civilians seeking refuge. Moreover, our bases are not safe themselves. 2 mortars fell in MONUSCO bases and compounds in the last 3 days, as well as countless bullets. Installations of former police unit staff in Jambar camp have been destroyed and burned. MONUSCO is storing voluntarily relinquished or abandoned weapons in accordance with international standards. MONUSCO is taking concrete steps to secure these weapons surrendered by various fighting elements to avoid any possible scenario where the mission could be put under pressure to hand over those weapons to any group. Casualty evacuation efforts remain a significant challenge. During the fighting in Sake, which began 4 days ago, peacekeepers were seriously injured. We continue to do our utmost to ensure timely evacuation of injured peacekeepers and other casualties to a level 3 hospital in Goma, despite continuing challenges. The fighting of the past week has also severely hampered supply convoys and consumed many resources held by MONUSCO's units. Damage to camps, including water tanks, generators, and vehicles, has further exacerbated the situation. Many troops are now running out of critical equipment, especially water, food, medical supplies, and blood. In some camps, fuel shortages have rendered generators inoperable, affecting communications equipment. In addition, a significant number of non-combatants have sought refuge in MONUSCO's camps in need of food, water, and medical care, further straining already limited supplies. The MONUSCO warehouse at the airport has been looted, further depleting supplies. The courthouse in Goma has been looted, and I can continue with this list. The proliferation of weapons in Goma poses a significant risk as combatants blend into the civilian population and abandoned military depots are looted by civilians. the mass influx of internally displaced persons without shelter, the separation of families, the proliferation of armed elements, and the escape of prisoners following a breakout from Goma prison increase the vulnerability of women and children to sexual and gender-based violence. Therefore, in line with the appeal of the Bishop of Goma, we call on all parties and the population to guarantee the protection of life and access to basic services for all and to prevent sexual violence. Armed clashes in Masisi, Rutshuru, and Nyiragongo continue to result in civilian casualties and displacements, further escalating the humanitarian crisis. Electricity and water supplies remain disrupted in Goma, and medical facilities are completely overwhelmed. Due to the intensity of the ongoing combat and the proximity of the front lines, humanitarian operations have been suspended or readjusted. Immediate action is required to alleviate the suffering of civilians and enable life-saving humanitarian efforts to proceed. Moreover, ethnically motivated attacks in a region with a very sensitive history need to be taken seriously. In the past 4 days, the Human Rights Office has documented at least one case of ethnically motivated lynching in an IDP site in Goma, as well as physical and verbal violence against journalists in Goma, all due to their perceived ethnic identity. In light of the ongoing crisis, we urgently require the end of jamming and spoofing, as well as the establishment of humanitarian corridors between Goma, Minova, and Bukavu. This will allow the resupply of essential items, the rotation of humanitarian staff, and the safe movement of civilians. We also appeal for the establishment of high-level diplomatic channels to ensure that critical airports, border points, and humanitarian access routes are reopened without delay. We stress that military action cannot resolve this conflict. It is imperative that all parties cease hostilities and commit to political dialogue in order to prevent further civilian suffering. Resuming the Rwanda process is of the utmost urgency to ensure a path towards de-escalation and to avert the looming threat of a third Congo war. We remind all parties of their obligation to uphold international humanitarian law and stress that attacks on United Nations peacekeepers may constitute war crimes. The degree of suffering that the population in Goma and its environments is enduring is truly unimaginable. Let us please draw on our humanity and do our utmost to bring an immediate end to such levels of violence and suffering. In conclusion, the situation in Goma requires urgent and coordinated international action. Despite the significant challenges, MONUSCO continues to play a vital role in this crisis in the Eastern DRC and has proven to be a beacon for myriad vulnerable groups seeking protection. However, the mission is challenged in ensuring the safety of its staff and premises, which has been severely impacted by the heavy direct and indirect fire used in these last few days, and to address the logistical, human rights, and humanitarian challenges we are all facing to ensure the mission's continued effectiveness. We call on all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians, open humanitarian corridors, and work towards a sustainable and peaceful resolution of the conflict. I thank you very much.
I thank Ms. Viviane van de Peer for the statement. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements. And I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr.
je
President, I wish
remercie
to
la
thank
représentante spéciale
the
adjointe du
Deputy
secrétaire
Special
général
Representative of the
pour sa
Secretary General
présentation et je
for her
salue
briefing.
la présence
I welcome
parmi
here
nous
among
de la
us
ministre des Affaires étrangères de
the
la
Minister
République
of Foreign
démocratique du
Affairs
Congo.
for the Democratic Republic
Le
of the
Conseil de
Congo.
sécurité
The
se
Security
réunit
Council is
une
meeting
nouvelle fois
once again
en raison de la
due
détérioration
to the
continue
sustained
de la
deterioration
situation
of the
dans le Nord
situation
Kivu.
in North Kivu.
Alors nous parlons,
As we
le
speak,
M23 prend le contrôle de
M23 is
Goma
taking control of Goma
avec le soutien
with the
actif du
active
Rwanda.
support of Rwanda.
Cela doit constituer un
That
signal
must
d'alerte
set
pour ce
alarm bells
Conseil,
ringing for this
comme
council,
cela avait été
as it
le
did
cas il y a 12 ans.
12 years ago.
Le risque de
The
contagion
risk of
régionale
regional
est
spillover
réel.
is real.
La prise de Goma
The
comporte des
seizure
risques
of Goma
majeurs pour la
brings with
sécurité des
it major
populations et elle
risks
conduit au
for the
déplacement de
security of
centaines
civilians
de milliers de
and
personnes.
prompts the
Il est
displacement of hundreds
impératif
of
d'y
thousands of
mettre un
people.
terme. La
It is
France
vital
condamne
to put an
fermement
end
cette
to that
offensive.
situation.
Le
France
M23 doit
firmly
cesser immédiatement
condemns
son
this
offensive
offensive.
et se
M23
retirer
must
des territoires
immediately
dont
cease
il
the
a pris le
offensive
contrôle.
and withdraw from
Le soutien
territories
aux groupes
over which
armés
it has seized
par toutes les
control.
parties
Support
doit
for armed
cesser.
groups by
La
all
priorité va
parties
donc au
must
retour
stop.
au
Our
cessez-le-feu et à
priority
la
must
reprise du
be
dialogue. Il n'y a pas
renewed
d'issue
support for a
militaire
ceasefire and the
au
resumption
conflit.
of dialogue. There
La
is no
France
military
réaffirme
solution
sa
to this conflict.
solidarité
France reaffirms
envers
its
la République
solidarity
démocratique du
with the
Congo et son
Democratic Republic and
attachement
its
à son
unwavering
intégrité
commitment to
territoriale et à sa
upholding the
souveraineté.
DRC's
Ici comme
territorial
ailleurs,
integrity
le
and
respect
sovereignty.
de
Here
la Charte
and
des Nations
elsewhere,
Unies
compliance with the
s'impose.
UN Charter
La France
is
poursuit
the
ses
order of
contacts
the
au plus haut
day.
niveau
France
afin
continues
de
its engagement
relancer
at
un
the highest
processus
level in order
politique.
to
Nous saluons la
resume a political
mobilisation
process. We
régionale.
hail
Nous
regional
espérons que la réunion du
mobilization in
Conseil
this
de
regard,
paix et
and we
sécurité
hope
de l'Union
that the
africaine ce
African
jour
Union
et le
PSC
sommet de la
meeting
communauté
today
d'Afrique de
and the
l'Est demain
EAC summit
permettront
tomorrow will
d'avancer dans la
foster
direction d'une paix
progress
durable.
towards a
Le dialogue
sustainable,
engagé dans le cadre
lasting
des
peace.
processus de
Dialogue which
Luanda
has
et
been
Nairobi doit reprendre sans
initiated
délai.
within
La
the
France
Luanda and
apporte son
Nairobi
plein
process
soutien
must resume
à ces
as a matter
processus
of
et elle appelle
urgency.
les parties
France
à
supports
respecter leurs
these
engagements
regional
conclus
processes
dans le
and call
cadre
upon
du
parties to
processus
uphold
de
their
Luanda.
commitments entered into
Retrait
within the Luanda process.
des
These are
troupes
as
rwandaises
follows:
du
the
territoire
withdrawal of
congolais
Rwandan troops from
et mise
Congolese
en œuvre
territory
du
and the
plan de
implementation of
démantèlement
the
des
plan
forces
to
démocratiques de
dismantle
libération du
the
Rwanda.
Democratic Forces for the Liberation of
Enfin,
Rwanda, the
la France tient
FDLR.
à réaffirmer
Finally,
avec
France
force son
wishes to
soutien à la
forcefully
MONUSCO.
reaffirm its support for
Son mandat a
MONUSCO.
été renouvelé à
MONUSCO's
l'unanimité
mandate
le
was
20 décembre
unanimously
dernier. Nous
renewed on
condamnons
the
les
20th of
attaques
December.
menées
We
par le
condemn
M23 à
attacks
son encontre
waged by
qui ont
M23
conduit
against
à la
MONUSCO.
mort de plusieurs
These
casques bleus ces derniers jours.
attacks have
Nous
claimed the lives of
exprimons nos
several blue
condoléances à
helmets
leurs
in recent
familles.
days. We convey our
Les
condolences
personnels
to their
des emprises des
family
Nations Unies
members.
doivent être respectés.
Personnel and
Les attaques
undertakings
contre
of
les
the
casques
United
bleus
Nations must be
ainsi que des
respected.
civils et
Attacks
des
against blue
personnels
helmet
humanitaires
civilians
sont
and
susceptibles de
humanitarian
constituer
personnel
des
are
crimes de
liable to
guerre.
constitute war
Un accès
crimes.
humanitaire complet doit être garanti et les
Comprehensive
violations
humanitarian
du
access
droit
must be
international
guaranteed.
humanitaire et des droits
Violations
de
of
l'homme
IHL and
doivent
human
être
rights
condamnés.
must be
La
condemned.
France condamne à
France
nouveau le
once
déploiement de
again
systèmes de
condemns
missiles
the
solaires et de
deployment of
brouillage des
surface-to-air
signaux GPS dans
missiles
les
and the
zones
scrambling of
contrôlées
GPS
par le
signals in
M23
areas under
avec le soutien
M23
direct
control
des
with the
forces
direct
rwandaises de
support
défense.
of the Rwanda
La
Defense
MONUSCO doit
Force.
pouvoir
MONUSCO
continuer à
must
mener
be
son
able
action
to
pour
continue to do
protéger
its
les
work to
populations.
protect
La
civilians.
situation à
The
Goma
situation in
comporte des
Goma
conséquences
has
humanitaires et politiques
major
majeures.
humanitarian
Nous
and
nous
political
assurerons
ramifications.
que ce
We will
Conseil
ensure
reste
that this
pleinement
Council
mobilisé
remains fully
face à la gravité de
mobilized
cette
in view
situation.
of just how grave
Je vous
this
remercie.
situation is. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, thank you for convening this emergency meeting of the Security Council. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3+ members, Algeria, Guyana, Somalia, and my own country, Sierra Leone. At the outset, we pay tribute to the brave peacekeepers, MONUSCO personnel, and other UN staff who are risking their lives in pursuit of peace and the protection of civilians in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. We also honor those peacekeepers and SAMI DRC personnel who have made the ultimate sacrifice in service of peace. Our deepest condolences go to their families and to the government and people of South Africa, Malawi, and Uruguay. We express our gratitude to Ms. Viviane van der Peer, Deputy Special Representative for Protection and Operations in MONUSCO, for a comprehensive briefing on the dire situation on the ground. We also welcome the participation of Her Excellency Therese Karik-Wamba Wagner, State Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the DRC, as well as the representatives of all other participating states in this meeting. Mr. President, we commend the swift convening of this emergency meeting. In less than 72 hours, the Security Council has convened for a second time to address the rapidly evolving situation in Eastern DRC. The A3+ is deeply concerned about the volatility of the situation, the ongoing conflict, and the resulting stalemate, which present a high risk of a broader regional conflict. We have listened attentively to Ms. van der Per's briefing, and it is clear that the people of Goma, and indeed the wider Congolese population, deserve more than a temporary cessation of the M23/AFC offensive. They need the guns to be silent through a comprehensive political process that will not only end their suffering, but also guarantee respect for the DRC's sovereignty and territorial integrity. In this regard, we make the following point. First, we call for an immediate de-escalation of the tension and a restoration of calm in Goma. We urge the M23 AFC to cease its advances and for all parties to exercise the utmost restraint to ensure the protection of civilians. Given the unpredictable and volatile nature of the situation in Goma and surrounding areas, it is imperative that all efforts, whether from MONUSCO or other actors, focus on safeguarding the population from harm. Given Goma's critical role in facilitating access to the region, all efforts to protect civilians must also address the need for humanitarian access, as well as the safety and security of UN peacekeepers and SAMI DRC personnel. The M23/AFC must refrain from obstructing humanitarian assistance or closing humanitarian corridors. The A3+ stresses the critical need for uninterrupted aid to reach the most vulnerable and reminds all parties of their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilian lives and ensure the delivery of aid to those in need. Second, as we have stated before, the situation in Eastern DRC will not be resolved through military means. It requires a political solution, supported by diplomacy and regional cooperation. Since our last meeting on Sunday, we have seen significant African diplomatic efforts to support the Congolese people and encourage both the DRC and Rwanda to reach a mutually acceptable resolution. We recognize the leadership of President William Ruto of Kenya, who has called for an East African Community meeting that will take place in the coming hours. Earlier today, the African Union Peace and Security Council convened an emergency ministerial meeting in Addis Ababa. These regional efforts are commendable, but what is needed now is the commitment of both Rwanda and the DRC to engage in direct negotiations under the Luanda process in good faith with the support of all these initiatives to bring a prompt resolution to the situation in Goma. We strongly call on both Rwanda and DRC to fully engage under the Luanda process, which is being led by the African Union's designated mediator, His Excellency João Lourenço, President of Angola, to resolve the outstanding issues between them. We are aware that the longer this deadlock persists, the greater the risk of further escalation, which will become increasingly difficult to contain. If the political leadership of Rwanda and the DRC can engage in direct talks, there is hope for delivering much-needed relief to the Congolese people. Third, to achieve a lasting solution that fully respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC, while also addressing Rwanda's security concerns, it is critical for both countries to fully implement their commitment under the Luanda process. The A3+ remain convinced that the Luanda process offers the best pathway to peace in the DRC. Through this process, a ceasefire agreement was reached, though regrettably breached, along with an agreement on a harmonized plan, reinforced ad hoc verification mechanism, and a comprehensive concept of operations. The A3+ calls on all parties to honor their commitment under the Luanda process. Given the unfortunate development on the ground, and in pursuit of peace and stability in the DRC and the wider region, the A3+ urges the government of Rwanda to withdraw its troops from DRC territories without preconditions and without delay, and to cease its reported support to the M23 AFC. Similarly, we urge the government of the DRC to sever its ties with FDLR and to implement its commitment to neutralize this group. We also regret that President Lourenço of Angola had no choice but to evacuate members of the reinforced ad hoc verification mechanism due to the untenable security situation in Eastern DRC. While the ceasefire agreement has been violated, the mechanism remains incomplete and has not been fully operationalized. Fourth, the natural wealth of the DRC must translate into prosperity for its people. All actors, both local and external, who continue to illegally exploit the country's resources and fuel the conflict must be held accountable. Mr. President, the A3+ expresses deep concern and regret over the reported attacks on embassies in Kinshasa amidst protests relating to the M23 AFC rebel group's offensive in Eastern DRC. These acts against diplomatic missions and their personnel violate international law. As we acknowledge the legitimate concerns of the Congolese people regarding the security situation in Eastern DRC and the activities of the M23 rebel group, we call for the protection of diplomatic missions and strongly urge all parties to refrain from violence, respect diplomatic norms, and exercise restraint. Peaceful and constructive engagement remains the most effective way to address these pressing issues. In closing, we are all well aware of the critical importance of Goma to the Congolese people. Goma is the heart of the DRC. Allowing this vital city to remain under the control of a rebel group sends a disturbing message about the ability or willingness of the international community to prevent threats to international peace and security from flourishing. It is a moral imperative for all actors, including this Council, to act decisively to address the unfolding situation in Goma and to tackle the structural root causes of this conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Let me start by thanking DSOSG Van der Peer for briefing us today. And I welcome the participation of DRC Foreign Minister Wagner, alongside other representatives from the region and troop-contributing countries. President, the UK is deeply alarmed by the events that have unfolded in Eastern DRC. Since we met on Sunday, M23, with support from the Rwandan Defence Forces, have closed in on Goma. M23 have declared that it is now under their control. The humanitarian impacts are dire. The advances have displaced close to 1 million people in North and South Kivu. Civilian casualties are rising. Hundreds of thousands of people who have already fled from M23's advances, many of them several times before, are now on the move again, with virtually nowhere safe to go. How many times must they pack up their lives and flee? The cycle must end. The UK is also deeply concerned by the limited ability of humanitarian actors to get help to those who need it. Key humanitarian routes, land, water and air, are closed, and hospitals are overcrowded, with staff risking their own lives to provide emergency assistance. More than 800,000 people in the area who were prioritised for support may no longer receive vital food and nutritional assistance. We call on the parties not to obstruct the vital services that humanitarians are providing, and to cease hostilities and uphold the protection of humanitarian workers, as required in international humanitarian law. We also urge all parties to consider essential humanitarian corridors to allow the resupply and delivery of essential life-saving items and the freedom and safe movement of civilians and humanitarian actors. President, the UK is also deeply concerned by the continued endangering of peacekeepers' lives. On Sunday, I expressed my condolences to the families of the 13 who'd already been killed. Since then, 4 more peacekeepers have tragically been killed. We urge an immediate end to this violence. We commend the leadership of MONUSCO, your courage under fire, and we thank you for the vital work of the mission. Finally, President, the UK's Foreign Secretary and Minister for Africa have spoken with Rwanda at the highest levels, as well as with wider partners in the region, and we have made clear that there can be no military solution. We urge all parties to cease hostilities and return to diplomatic talks immediately without preconditions. We remain committed to ensuring this Council takes the necessary action to support an end to this conflict. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
благодарим
we'd
заместителя
like to thank the
спецпредставителя
Deputy
Генерального
Special
секретаря
Representative of the Secretary General, Vivian van der Per, for her briefing.
Приветствуем
We
участие в заседании
welcome
министра
to
иностранных
the
дел
meeting the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Teresa Banga, and the
остальных стран,
representative of
запросивших
the
по правилам
other
37.
countries who've requested the floor under Rule 37.
Уважаемые коллеги, 2
Distinguished
дня назад
colleagues,
мы
2
встречались в
days
этом
ago
зале
we met in
и
this chamber
обсуждали
and discussed
тревожное
the
развитие
worrisome
ситуации на востоке
developments in
этой
the
страны.
situation in the Eastern
Последние
DRC.
48 часов
Over the
она
past 48
стремительно
hours,
деградировала,
the
особенно в
situation has
связи с
significantly
захватом Гомы,
deteriorated,
где
especially with the
находится
seizure
свыше
of
миллиона
Goma,
гражданских
where
лиц.
there are more than 1 million civilians
Россия
located.
решительно
Russia
осуждает
firmly
действия
condemns the
группировки
actions
М-23.
of M23.
Мы призываем к
We call
немедленной
for
остановке
a swift cessation
боестолкновений
of
и выводу
hostilities
бойцов этого
and a
незаконного
withdrawal of
военного
the
формирования
rebels of the illegal
из
armed
захваченных
formation
населенных
from
пунктов из
the
занятых
towns,
территорий.
villages and territory they've seized.
Мы также
We
призываем
also
внешние силы
urge
прекратить
external
поддержку
forces to
М-23
cease their
и
support for
отозвать свои воинские
M23
подразделения.
and to recall their military
Необходимо без
units.
промедления
There's a need without delay
возобновить
to resume the
переговорный процесс в
negotiation
Руанде.
process in Luanda.
Нельзя допускать
We
разрастания
must not
эскалации,
allow a
создающей угрозу
spillover
жизни
of the
людей
escalation
по
which
обе
could
стороны
threaten the
границы
lives of
и
people on
чреватой
both sides of the
скатыванием
border
в
and
межгосударственного
is
конфликта
likely
регионального масштаба.
to turn into an interstate conflict on a regional scale.
Мы глубоко
We
озабочены
are seriously
гуманитарными
concerned by the
последствиями
humanitarian repercussions of what's
На
going
наших с
on.
вами глазах и без
In
того
front
тяжелая
of our
ситуация
very
в
eyes,
Северном Киеве
the
превращается в
already difficult
настоящую
situation in
гуманитарную
North
катастрофу.
Kivu is turning into an utter
Goma
humanitarian
фактически
disaster.
отрезана от
Goma
внешнего
de
мира,
facto is cut off
что
from the
может
outside
привести к
world.
тяжелейшим
This may
последствиям
have
для жителей
serious
города
consequences for the
и бежавших
inhabitants
туда
of the
внутренне
town and the
перемещенных лиц.
IDPs who have fled there.
Вновь
Once
выражаем
again, we would
соболезнования
like to
семьям
express our
погибших
condolences
граждан
to the families
ДРК,
of the
миротворцев
civilian
ООН
victims
и
of the
павших бойцов
DRC,
сообщества
the UN
развития Европы.
peacekeepers, and the fallen
Мы
SADC
солидарны с
soldiers.
правительством
We
ДРК и
stand in
государств,
solidarity
потерявших
with the
своих
governments of the
военнослужащих.
DRC and those
Желаем
states who've
скорейшего
lost their
выздоровления всем нам.
service personnel.
Хотел бы
We
подчеркнуть, что Россия
wish them
безоговорочно
speedy
осуждает
recovery.
нападение
We'd like to
миротворцев.
underscore that Russia
Это абсолютно
unequivocally condemns the
неприемлемо.
attacks on
Мы
peacekeepers. It's
твердо
absolutely
поддерживаем
unacceptable.
миссию ООН по
We
стабилизации Демократической
firmly
Республики
support
Конго,
the
ее
UN
руководство и
peacekeeping mission
главы
in the stabilization mission in the
Мы
DRC,
также
its
осуждаем
leadership,
любые
and the
нападения
Blue
или
Helmets. We
проявления
also
агрессии в
condemn any
отношении
attacks
иностранных
and acts of
дипломатических
aggression
представительств.
regarding international
действия не
diplomatic
имеют ничего
representation.
общего с
Such
мирными
actions
демонстрациями.
have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with peaceful demonstrations.
Призываем
We
Киншасу
urge
обеспечить
Kinshasa
защиту
to ensure the
зарубежных
protection
миссий и
of foreign
дипломатического
missions
персонала
and
в
diplomatic
соответствии с
staff,
Венской конвенцией
pursuant to
и
the Vienna
международными
Convention
обязательствами.
and its international
Насилие на
obligations.
востоке ДРК
The
необходимо
violence in Eastern
остановить.
DRC needs to
Однако
stop.
военного
However,
пути
there's no
урегулирования
military
кризиса
path
не
to
существует.
resolve this crisis.
Совершенно
It is
очевидно, что это
absolutely clear
возможно
that this
только в
is only
результате
possible as a
политической
result of
договоренности.
political agreements.
Убеждены, что
We're convinced
луандийский
that the
процесс
Luanda
остается той
process
площадкой,
remains
где
the
эта
best
договоренность
forum
может быть достигнута.
where agreements can be reached.
Мы
We
внимательно
carefully
выслушали
listened to the
представителя Анголы в ходе
representative of
заседания
Angola
этого
during
совета,
the meeting
прошедшего
of the
в воскресенье.
council on Sunday.
Он прямо сказал, что единственным
Angola
препятствием
clearly
для
stated that the
подписания
only
документа о
obstacle to
примирении между
preventing a
Киншасой и Кигалью
signature of a
остался
reconciliation
вопрос о
document
прекращении
between Kinshasa and
государственного
Kigali
взаимодействия
was
с
the issue of
незаконными
cessation
вооруженными
of
формированиями.
government interaction
Прежде
with
всего,
the
это
illegal
касается
armed
М-23.
formations and primarily with the
Без
M23.
урегулирования статуса этой
Without
группировки в
settling the
рамках
status of this
межконгрессского диалога,
group as
попытки
part of
добиться
the
выздоровления
inter-Congolese
отношений
dialogue,
между ДРК и
any
Рвандой не
attempts to
принесут
improve the
устойчивого
situation
результата.
between the DRC and Rwanda will
В
not
этом
bear
смысле
lasting
крайне
fruit.
востребовали
Here,
срочный
there is
перезапуск
an urgent
найробийского
need for the
процесса
resumption of
или
the Nairobi
продвижение схожих
process
региональных
and the pushing
инициатив.
forward of similar regional initiatives. There's no
Альтернативы этому нет.
alternative to this.
Господин председатель,
Mr.
попытки
President,
урегулировать
attempts
кризис
to
также
settle
будут
the
бесплодными,
crisis
если
will
страны
also
региона
not bear
Великих озер
fruit
не
if
примут
the
решительных
countries
мер
of the
для
Great
борьбы
Lakes region
с
do not
незаконной
take decisive
эксплуатацией
measures
контрабандных
to
природных
combat the
ресурсов.
illegal exploitation
Их
and
львиная доля, как
smuggling
известно,
of
поступает
natural
именно
resources,
с
the lion's
охваченного
share of which,
нестабильностью
as we
Востока
all
Африки.
know, come from the Eastern DRC, which is beset by
Пересмотреть свои отношения
instability.
к
There's a
потреблению
need
этих ресурсов должны также
for
нерегиональные игроки
extra-regional
и
players
крупные
and
международные
large
ТНК,
transnational
в чьих
corporations to
интересах
review their
не
relationship with the
прекращается
use of
поток
these
незаконных
resources,
поставок кровавых
because
минералов.
in their interest there's this ongoing illegal supply of blood minerals.
Эти же государства
These
имеют все
states have
инструменты,
all
чтобы
instruments
остановить
available
горячую
to
фазу
them to stop
конфликта и
the
оказать давление
hot
на
phase,
стороны
so to
для
speak,
того,
of the
чтобы они
conflict and
вернулись к
to exert
переговорам.
pressure on the parties so they return to
Они должны быть
negotiations. They
задействованы для
must be
сохранения
harnessed
человеческой жизни
to
и прекращения
protect
страданий
people's lives and
сотен
to
тысяч
stop the
гражданских
suffering of
лиц.
hundreds of thousands of
К
civilians.
сожалению, все мы
Unfortunately,
видели,
we've
что
all
принятое
seen
Советом заявление
that the
не
statement of
остановило
the Council
М-23
has
и
not
тех, кто
stopped the
поддерживает
M23,
блокировку
and
от
those who
захвата Гомы
support
и
this
продолжения
group
боевых действий.
from seizing Goma and continuing their
Россия
hostilities.
со своей
Russia,
стороны
from
будет
its side,
использовать все
will do
возможности, в том
everything
числе на
possible,
площадке этого Совета, чтобы
including
остановить
through
эскалацию
here
и
in the Council,
восстановить
to stop the
перспективу
escalation
дипломатического
and to
регулирования в интересах
restore prospects for
стабилизации ситуации
diplomatic
на
settlement in the
востоке
interest
ДРК.
of stabilizing the
Благодарю.
situation in the Eastern DRC. Thank you very much indeed.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, President. Thank you, DSRSG, Vivian Van de Peer, for your briefing on the unacceptable events of the last 48 hours. The United States condemns the seizure of Goma and urges this Council to consider measures to halt the territorial advances by Rwandan troops and M23. We stand in firm support of the Congolese people and of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC, and urge Rwanda to respect the same. At the same time, we are watching with concern and deplore the destruction of diplomatic facilities in Kinshasa, and call on the DRC government to respect its obligations to protect diplomatic premises and personnel. We call for an immediate ceasefire, an end to this fighting. Rwanda must withdraw troops from the DRC. Rwanda and the DRC must return to the negotiating table and work toward a sustainable, peaceful solution. We remain deeply concerned about the human rights abuses, displacement, and other impacts on Congolese civilians suffering the brunt of this fighting. Civilians, including the growing number of IDPs and refugees in Sake, Goma, and beyond, must be protected. More than ever, humanitarian actors must be allowed to operate freely and deliver life-saving aid. The rights of all Goma's inhabitants, including former combatants, must be respected. We are similarly concerned that M23's and Rwanda's ongoing advances are opening up a bloody new front to this conflict in South Kivu, which no longer benefits from the roles MONUSCO assumed in the past to protect civilians and facilitate humanitarian assistance. We must not allow this violence to spiral into a wider regional conflict, which would incur a horrific human toll. We mourn all the Congolese who have lost their lives in this fighting. We also extend heartfelt condolences to the countries and families of UN peacekeepers and SAMI DRC troops lost during these attacks. We applaud MONUSCO for its commitment to protect civilians and the bravery and professionalism demonstrated by peacekeepers in recent weeks. As we have said before, Rwanda's support to M23 remains wholly at odds with its robust support to UN peacekeeping. Rwanda said on Sunday that it means no harm to MONUSCO. but 3 peacekeepers have been killed, with many more injured. Additionally, UN and humanitarian personnel, as well as civilians, are endangered by Rwanda's ongoing use of GPS interference and deployment of advanced weapons and systems. Hope is not lost. There is an end in sight to this fighting and a path for a regional dialogue, but the international community must act now. Those unwilling to return to the negotiating table must face a clear and unambiguous response from the Council. We must abandon the delusion of short-term military solutions and work instead toward a durable peace powered by regional economic arrangements for the Great Lakes' vast mineral wealth to ensure stability and prosperity for local populations. Addressing historical grievances, ending ethnic attacks, and other roots of this conflict must be done through a process that has clear incentives and unmistakable accountability. The international community has the tools in hand to end the fighting and build sustainable solutions to the Eastern DRC conflict. We must collectively marshal the will to leverage such tools, as the United States is fully prepared to do, or be prepared to accept unthinkable cost, measured in human lives. Indeed, as the United States observed at our briefing on Sunday, we will consider all the tools at our disposal in order to hold accountable those responsible for sustaining armed conflict, instability, and insecurity in the DRC. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, dear SRG Vanderpeer, for your briefing on this serious and evolving situation. I welcome this presence of Her Excellency Foreign Minister Wagner at this meeting. Mr. President, just 2 days ago, this Council convened urgently to address the situation in Eastern DRC. We were briefed on the dramatic escalation of Goma on a knife's edge, of peacekeepers being killed and civilians fleeing. Today, the situation has continued to deteriorate. Let me be clear. Denmark strongly condemns the ongoing offensive by M23 with support of the Rwanda Defense Forces and the military presence of Rwanda in DRC. We demand that M23, supported by the RDF, immediately halt and reverse their territorial expansion and withdraw. We demand that Rwanda ceases its support to the M23 and that the DRC ceases its support to the FDLR. Colleagues, we've all seen the devastating images. Shelling and heavy artillery in the city center of Goma, civilians fleeing, overcrowded hospitals, and ongoing looting. Denmark is extremely concerned about the risk of urban conflict, as well as sexual violence following the influx of armed elements and the Goma prison escape. Likewise, we are deeply alarmed by the risk of attacks against human rights defenders who now fear individual persecution and ethnically motivated attacks. We also express our deep concern with the recent attacks on diplomatic missions in Kinshasa. This is unacceptable. Mr. President, against this dangerous and rapidly developing backdrop, allow me to highlight 4 key points. First, Denmark demands an immediate cessation of hostilities, as well as unhindered, rapid, and safe humanitarian access to all populations in and around Goma. This includes open humanitarian corridors, open land borders, and airspace. This cannot be understated. In line with international humanitarian law, medical and humanitarian personnel must be protected, and their ability to provide life-saving care must be ensured. Parties must engage with the UN humanitarian actors for deconfliction purposes and allow trauma and specialized medical teams urgent access. Upholding IHL is not an option, it's an obligation. Second, Denmark firmly condemns any form of violence targeting civilians and objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian populations. We demand their immediate protection and the respect for human rights, regardless of ethnic group, gender, or age. Perpetrators of any attack against civilians must be held to account, no matter their rank or affiliation. Third, we express our full support to MONUSCO as it fulfills its critical mandate facing extremely difficult circumstances. We remind the parties that any involvement in attacks against MONUSCO peacekeepers may constitute a war crime and a basis for sanctioned designations pursuant to United Nations Security Council resolutions. Fourth, Mr. President, as we underlined just 2 days ago, there is no military solution to this conflict, only a political one. We urge DRC and Rwanda to immediately and in good faith fully re-engage and fully recommit to diplomatic talks in the regional peace processes in place. The Luanda and Nairobi processes are the means to solve this conflict. Colleagues, we are not here merely to request that the parties uphold their obligations under international law. When these obligations are consistently violated, it is incumbent upon us to consider all appropriate tools at the Council's disposal. Mr. President, to conclude, the people of the DRC deserve peace. The peoples of the Great Lake region deserve peace. As the UN body charged with the maintenance of international peace and security, this Council should act decisively in support of this goal. Count on Denmark's support. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Algeria for convening this urgent meeting. We also thank Ms. van der Peer for her briefing. Mr. President, just 2 days ago, this Council condemned the advances of M23 and demanded that the offensive and advances towards Goma immediately stop. Unfortunately, the developments since then have only confirmed our fears. Mr. President, the M23's continued offensive, including the seizure of Goma, with support from Rwanda Defense Forces, is a clear threat to regional stability. We strongly condemn these actions. Slovenia renews its demand for the immediate ceasefire and the unconditional withdrawal of M23 from the occupied territories. The risk of this conflict escalating into a wider regional crisis must not be underestimated, and recent developments have only amplified these fears. Our message is clear. The violence must stop, and diplomacy must take the lead. Slovenia continues to call on Rwanda to fully withdraw its forces from the DRC territory in accordance with international law and to cease its support to M23. We strongly condemn the ongoing violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC. They must be respected. We also continue to call on the DRC to cease all cooperation with the FDLR and other armed groups. We are gravely alarmed by the escalating risks in Goma and its surroundings, with the risks of urban fighting and the use of heavy weapons in densely populated areas. There is no time to waste. Mr. President, this is yet another nightmare chapter in this ongoing conflict, forcing hundreds of thousands of civilians to flee, too many of them not for the first time. They are living in fear, they are hungry, they are exposed to vulnerabilities which are further intensified by the presence and influx of armed elements. Restoring and returning to an agreed ceasefire is imperative, but immediate measures are also needed to protect civilians, humanitarian and medical facilities, critical infrastructure, including electricity, water, and communication networks. Safe humanitarian corridors must enable aid delivery and civilian evacuations. Heavy weapons and troops must be withdrawn from the IDP sites. We cannot stress this enough. International humanitarian aid and international humanitarian and human rights law must be upheld by all parties at all times. We call on both countries to exercise maximum restraint. We remain hopeful that strong African engagement through the African Union, the East African Community, and the Luanda processes can help turn the tide through dialogue, and we commend these efforts. Strengthened by this Council, continued engagement, and bilateral efforts, these actions highlight the value of complementing all paths to peace, and Slovenia fully supports them. We urge Rwanda and the DRC to heed calls for peace from the region and the wider international community, and especially those fleeing bullets and bombs, to de-escalate and re-engage in a diplomatic process. Mr. President, we strongly support MONUSCO and its vital mission to protect civilians and recall the need to ensure their safety and security. We unequivocally condemn all attacks and threats against MONUSCO personnel, humanitarian and medical workers who, even as we speak, continue to carry out their life-saving work under fire. In closing, Mr. President, let me express Slovenia's grave concern over the attacks on diplomatic missions in Kinshasa. Any such actions are entirely unacceptable and a clear violation of international law. We call for the protection of diplomatic missions in strict accordance with the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this emergency meeting following Sundays. I thank Deputy SRSG Van de Per for her sobering briefing. I welcome Minister Wagner of the DRC. At the outset, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its steadfast support for MONUSCO and the regional and sub-regional organizations for their tireless efforts in addressing this perilous crisis. We also reiterate our firm commitment to ensuring the safety and security of MONUSCO peacekeepers. At the same time, we strongly condemn the attacks on diplomatic missions in Kinshasa and urgently call for their immediate cessation. We urge the DRC government to fulfill its obligations under international law by ensuring the protection of all diplomatic missions within its territory. Mr. President, I would like to underscore 3 points today as we confront the devastating and fluid developments on the ground. First, we deeply regret that the unified call of the Security Council during Sunday's meeting, and along with the subsequent press statement, has been blatantly disregarded by the M23 and Rwanda. We demand that the M23 immediately halts its unjustifiable military actions in Eastern DRC and withdraw from its offensive in Goma. Their reckless actions are forcing civilians to flee with no safe refuge, endangering hundreds of thousands of innocent lives. Equally critical, we urge Rwanda to refrain from further escalating the conflict. We must once again stress our urgent appeal to Rwanda to cease all forms of support to M23 and promptly withdraw any unauthorized military presence from DRC territory. These actions undermine the foundational principles of the UN Charter, including respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. Second, the Security Council must consider all measures at its disposal to bring an end to this devastating conflict. The Council must deliver a more decisive and unequivocal message. In addition, concrete actions must be pursued to effectively influence the strategic calculations of the parties involved in the conflict. We must recall that it was a strong diplomatic pressure that stopped the M23 back in 2012. A thorough investigation into the attacks against the peacekeepers is also vital. The safety and security of UN peacekeepers is a top priority for the Security Council. All perpetrators of violations of international humanitarian and international human rights laws, including sexual and gender-based violence, must also be held accountable. Third, both the DRC and Rwanda must return to meaningful negotiations and fully honor their obligations under the Rwanda process. We reaffirm our full support for President Lourenço of Angola in his critical mediation efforts. We also look forward to the African Union Peace and Security Council playing a key role in exerting necessary pressure following its emergency ministerial meeting held this morning. Furthermore, we encourage sustained and coordinated pressure from all regional and international actors at the highest levels of government to help urgently de-escalate this conflict. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Security Council must take action. Most importantly, we must not lose sight of the innocent civilians who, even as we meet here today, are awaiting the Council's action. The Republic of Korea remains steadfast in its commitment to constructive engagement, working collectively to swiftly and decisively overturn the consequences of unlawful military actions. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. At the outset, President, I'd like to thank you for convening this emergency meeting. I thank the SISG Van der Berg for the briefing. I welcome the Foreign Minister, Kai Kwamba of DRC, to the meeting today. Since Council's Sunday consideration of the situation in Eastern DRC, the ground situation has taken a nosedive. M23 overran Goma, the capital of North Kivu province, causing massive civilian displacement and increasing the risk of a greater conflict. The developments are deeply worrying. China reiterates our firm support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC and opposition to any violations of the UN Charter and international law. China demands that M23 to immediately cease all hostilities and withdraw from Goma and other occupied areas. China hopes that Rwanda attaches importance to the calls from SD Guterres and relevant African countries. Stop military support for M23 and immediately withdraw all its military forces from the territory of the DRC. We urge parties to the conflict to abide by international humanitarian law and to protect the security of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Meanwhile, the security of foreign nationals and institutions in DRC should be protected too. China once again strongly condemns M23's attacks against UN peacekeepers. We salute MONUSCO for sticking to its post under extremely dangerous circumstances and support its continued activities, including protection of civilians pursuant to the mandate of the Security Council. We reiterate that any attacks targeting UN peacekeepers are unacceptable and urge parties to refrain from any actions that may endanger peacekeeping camps and peacekeepers. President, it should be underscored that there is no military solution to the issue of Eastern DRC and that diplomatic negotiations are the only way out. China supports the leaders of Angola, South Africa, Kenya, among others, in conducting emergency communication with countries concerned, and welcome East African Community's announcement of a forthcoming emergency meeting. We call on Rwanda and the DRC to return to the track of diplomatic dialogue as soon as possible and to implement the mutual commitments made under the Rwanda process, including commitments to neutralizing FDLR. We hope the two countries can actively respond to the mediation efforts of the international community and regional countries and maintain dialogue and negotiations to resolve concerns. At present, the situation in Eastern DRC is at a critical juncture fraught with peril. China supports the Security Council in keeping its unity, taking necessary actions to create favorable conditions to prevent the situation from worsening further and to push for a political settlement. I thank you.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
I thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we thank you for convening this meeting on this urgent topic. We thank Deputy SRSG Vivian Van der Peer for her valuable briefing. We also welcome the participation of the Foreign Minister of the DRC in this meeting, as well as the permanent representatives of Rwanda, Uruguay, Angola, Guatemala, Zimbabwe, and Burundi. Mr. President, since we met on Sunday, the M23 largely seems to be in control of Goma. Thousands of people are currently fleeing their homes, adding to the millions already internally displaced in Eastern DRC. Many UN and other peacekeeping troops are still encountering mortar and small arms fire. 3 UN peacekeepers have lost their lives and 22 have been injured. Sami DRC has also taken fatalities and casualties. We once again express our deepest condolences to the families of the fallen peacekeepers and pay tribute to their bravery, and especially those who died in the line of duty. I would like to make the following points. First, we strongly condemn M23's offensive on Goma. It must immediately stop its advance and vacate all territories it has occupied. We condemn the violations of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC. All foreign forces must be withdrawn from the territory of the DRC. Second, the M23 siege of Goma has grave humanitarian consequences. The UN Secretariat and other humanitarian actors, in consultations with the DRC, should urgently develop a plan for the protection of civilians, the handling of internally displaced people, and addressing the humanitarian crisis in Eastern DRC. The M23 must not impede access for immediate, safe, and unhindered humanitarian aid and humanitarian personnel to the affected areas and to the affected people, including through humanitarian corridors. Third, we strongly condemn the continued attacks on the peacekeepers. Attacks on peacekeepers constitute war crimes, and those responsible for perpetrating, supporting, and sponsoring these attacks must be held accountable. At the same time, we deplore the attacks on diplomatic facilities in Kinshasa. We ask the UN Secretariat and MONUSCO, in consultations with the DRC, to urgently present an effective plan to ensure the safety and security of MONUSCO and other peacekeepers, including through the steps that they have already taken. Fourth, we stress that there is no military solution to the conflict in Eastern DRC. We call on Rwanda and the DRC to cease hostilities and to immediately revive the Luanda process of dialogue under the mediatory leadership of President Lorenzo of Angola. The understandings reached under this process, that is the neutralization of the FDLR and the withdrawal of Rwandan forces from DRC, should be maintained and implemented even as the challenge posed by the M23 is confronted and resolved. We hope that the reconciliation within DRC will be achieved, especially through the Nairobi process. We also extend our full support to the Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region in promoting dialogue to resolve the conflict in Eastern DRC. Fifth, we appreciate the communiqué issued today by the African Peace and Security Council on the situation in DRC, in Eastern DRC. African institutions would no doubt have to play a very important role in bringing the decades-old conflict to an end in accordance with the call for African solutions to African problems and silencing the guns. Sixth, the Security Council and the Secretary General will need to evaluate the future role of MONUSCO in the evolving circumstances in Eastern DRC. In our view, the mission must be maintained and its mandate reviewed and adapted to respond to the new circumstances and operating environment. The mission will need to be adequately reinforced and equipped to discharge its current or modified mandate. Finally, Mr. President, we once again call to address the issue of the illegal exploitation of the DRC's natural resources, which is the root cause of this conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Ms. van der Per, Deputy SRSG, for briefing us on this urgent meeting today, and commend the courage of all of MONUSCO's personnel in these very difficult circumstances. I would also like to welcome the participation of the Honorable Foreign Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo in our meeting. Mr. President, allow me to emphasize 4 key points. First, we strongly condemn the capture of the town of Sake on January 23rd and the invasion of Goma on January 27th by M23. We reiterate that the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of the DRC must be fully respected. The presence of Rwandan troops on the territory of DRC and the support to the M23, as also stated by the Secretary General on January 26, are very concerning and are strongly condemned. We call on Rwanda to cease its support to the M23 and to withdraw its forces now. Second, we call for urgent de-escalation, and we stress that it is more imperative than ever that particularly Rwanda and DRC commit to the ceasefire as agreed last August, re-engage the political dialogue, and implement all decisions and commitments agreed under the Rwanda process. Greece will continue to support African-led initiatives and welcomes the emergency ministerial session on the conflict in Eastern DRC convened today by the African Union Peace and Security Council and the upcoming meeting of SADC tomorrow. We call DRC and Rwanda to return immediately to the table of negotiations. Third, we are deeply concerned about the grave humanitarian security consequences of the M23 offensive in North Kivu. All parties must respect international humanitarian law and ensure unrestricted humanitarian access. We strongly condemn all forms of human rights violations, abuses, violence against civilians, sex and gender-based violence in particular. Fourth, we reiterate our full support to MONUSCO, which is acting within its mandate and doing critical work in the DRC, including in the area of Goma, stress a strong commitment to the safety and security of its peacekeepers, condemns the attacks committed against personnel, and offer condolences to the families and government of the deceased peacekeepers. MONUSCO must be granted full access and freedom of movement to effectively fulfill its mandate and address urgent needs. The protection of civilians and humanitarian personnel must remain an absolute priority. Attacks against peacekeepers may constitute potential war crimes, and those attacks against MONUSCO peacekeepers form also a basis for potential sanction designations. Mr. President, we stand ready to consider any further engagement of this Council as unnecessary. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias, señor
Thank you very
presidente.
much indeed,
Damos
Mr.
la más
President.
cordial bienvenida a la
We
representante
warmly
especial
welcome
adjunta de
the Deputy
MONUSCO,
Special
la señora
Representative
Vivian Van de
from
Per. Le
MONUSCO,
agradecemos por su
Ms.
presentación
Vivian Van
informativa
de Per. We thank
y
her for her
también
briefing.
a la participación
We also
de la ministra de
welcome
Relaciones
the Minister
Exteriores,
for
Son
Foreign
Excelencia
Affairs,
Thérèse
Her
Kayikwamba
Excellency Ms.
Wagner,
Thérèse
de la
Kayikwamba
República
Wagner
Democrática del Congo.
of the
Señor
DRC.
presidente, distinguidos
Mr.
miembros del
President,
Consejo de
distinguished
Seguridad,
members of the Security
Panamá expresa
Council,
su
Panama
profunda
expresses its
preocupación por
grave
la
concern
alarmante
at the
situación
alarming
que se
situation
desarrolla en la
currently
República
playing out
Democrática
in the
del Congo.
Democratic Republic of the
En los
Congo.
últimos
In
días
recent
hemos sido
days, we
testigos
have
de una
witnessed
escalada de
an
violencia que
escalation
ha
of
culminado
violence
con la
which has
entrada del
culminated
M23
in
en la ciudad de Goma,
M23's entry into the
con
city
el
of
apoyo de
Goma,
las fuerzas
that
de
with the
defensa de
support
Ruanda,
of the Rwanda Defense
según lo
Force.
informado por el grupo de
This
expertos.
was reported on
Esta
by the
ofensiva
group of experts.
ha desencadenado
That
una crisis
offensive
humanitaria de
unleashed a
proporciones devastadoras.
humanitarian crisis of
Miles de
devastating
civiles
proportions.
se han
Thousands
visto
of
obligados a
civilians
abandonar
have
sus
been
hogares,
forced to flee their
buscando
homes,
refugio en
seeking
condiciones
refuge in
precarias
unsafe,
y
volatile
enfrentando la
conditions,
suspensión
and
de
they are now
servicios
facing the
básicos
suspension of
esenciales.
essential basic
La
services.
interrupción de estos
The
servicios ha
suspension of
dejado
these
a la población
services
civil
has
en una
left the
situación de
civilian
vulnerabilidad
population
extrema.
extremely vulnerable.
La falta de
The lack
acceso
of
a agua
access to
potable,
drinking water,
electricidad,
electricity,
atención médica
healthcare,
y otros
and
servicios
other core
esenciales
services
agrava el
is
sufrimiento de
worsening
los
the
desplazados
suffering
y
of
residentes
displaced persons
locales.
as well as local residents.
El alto comisionado de las Naciones
The
Unidas
United
para los
Nations High
Refugiados
Commissioner for
ha expresado su
Refugees
profunda
expressed his
preocupación
grave
por el
concern
agravamiento de la
at
violencia y
the
la crisis
worsening of the
humanitaria
violence
en el
and the
este de la
humanitarian crisis
RDC,
in Eastern DRC.
señalando
He
que el número
indicated
de
that the
desplazados
number of
internos
internally displaced
ha aumentado
persons
en más de
has increased
400,000
by
en lo que va
more
del
than
año.
400,000
La
this
República de
year
Panamá
alone.
reitera su
The
rechazo
Republic of
a
Panama
cualquier
reiterates
forma de
its
violencia
repudiation of
que
any
atente
form
contra la
of violence
seguridad e
which
integridad
undermines
física de la
the
población
security and
civil.
physical integrity of the
Hacemos un
civilian
llamado
population.
urgente a
We
todas las
issue
partes
an urgent appeal
involucradas
to all
para que
parties
cesen las
involved to
hostilidades de
cease hostilities
inmediato y
immediately
respeten el derecho
and to
internacional
adhere to
humanitario.
international humanitarian law.
Apoyamos plenamente el
fully
llamado
support the
de las
appeal
entidades de las
issued
Naciones
by
Unidas para
UN
habilitar pausas
entities for
humanitarias
the
temporales en
authorization
áreas
of
críticas,
temporary
así como para
humanitarian
el
pauses in
establecimiento de
critical
corredores
areas,
humanitarios
as well as
seguros
for the
y
establishment
efectivos.
of safe and effective humanitarian
De igual
corridors.
manera, Reiteramos nuestro
Moreover, we
firme
reiterate
respaldo a la
our staunch
invaluable
support
labor de la
for the
MONUSCO,
invaluable work
cuyo
done by
compromiso
MONUSCO.
con la paz y la
MONUSCO's
seguridad en
commitment
la
to peace and
región
security
es
in the region
incuestionable.
is beyond doubt.
Reconocemos
We
los complejos
recognize the
desafíos que
complex
enfrenta la
challenges
misión
facing the
en un
mission
entorno
in
altamente
a highly
inestable y
unstable
apreciamos
environment,
profundamente
and
sus
we
incansables
deeply
esfuerzos para
appreciate the
proteger a la
mission's
población
tireless
civil
efforts to
y
protect
fortalecer
civilians and
las
to
instituciones del
strengthen
Estado de Derecho.
institutions, the
Señor
rule of law.
presidente, el domingo durante
Mr.
la sesión de
President,
emergencia,
on Sunday
Panamá
during the
expresó su
emergency meeting,
solidaridad
Panama
y
expressed its
acompañamiento a los
solidarity
cascos
with and
azules y
support
sus
for the blue
familias.
helmets and their
Es
families.
inaceptable que hoy
It is
nuevamente nos veamos en
unacceptable
la
that today,
terrible
once
situación
again, we find
de tener
ourselves
que
in the
expresar
terrible situation of
nuevamente
having
nuestro más
to once
sentido
again
pésame por la
convey
pérdida
our
de la
deepest
vida de
condolences
4
following
más que
the
murieron en la
loss
línea de
of 4
combate.
more lives on the front
Reconocemos los
lines.
esfuerzos
We
regionales
recognize
que se
efforts
llevan
made
a
at a
cabo para
regional level
enfrentar
that were
esta
made
crisis.
to address
En
this crisis.
particular, destacamos la iniciativa del
we
presidente de
point to the
Kenia,
initiative
William
taken
Ruto,
by the President of
quien ha
Kenya, William
convocado para
Ruto.
mañana una
He
reunión de
has
emergencia de la
convened
Comunidad
for
de África
tomorrow
del
an
Este
emergency
y
meeting
el
of the
Consejo de Paz y
EAC,
Seguridad de la
and we
Unión Africana.
recognize what's been done by the
Ambas
AU Peace
iniciativas
and
con el
Security
objetivo de
Council. Both
garantizar
initiatives
la
have the
protección de
goal
los
of
civiles y fomentar el
protecting
diálogo sincero entre las
civilians
partes en
and of
conflicto.
fostering candid dialogue between the parties
Señores,
to the conflict.
estamos
Ladies and gentlemen,
observando la
we
escalada
are
de este
witnessing the
conflicto en
escalation of
tiempo
this
real.
conflict in real time.
Es el momento
Now
oportuno para que
is
este
the
Consejo
time
actúe de
for
manera
this council
contundente
to take
con el fin de
decisive
garantizar el
action in
acceso
order to
irrestricto a la ayuda
guarantee
humanitaria
unfettered
y
access to
restablecer los
humanitarian
servicios
aid and
básicos
to
en
restore
las áreas
basic
afectadas.
services in areas affected.
La población congoleña
The
debe
people
recibir el
of the
apoyo de la
DRC
comunidad
must receive the
internacional
international
basado en los
community's
principios de la
support
Carta de
in
las Naciones
line
Unidas
with the
para
principles of the
evitar
UN
una crisis
Charter
regional.
to avoid a regional
Reafirmamos nuestro
conflagration.
compromiso
We
inquebrantable
reaffirm our
con la
tireless
soberanía
commitment
e
to the
integridad
sovereignty and
territorial
territorial
de la
integrity
República
of the Democratic
Democrática del
Republic of the
Congo.
Congo.
Exigimos al
We
M23 y a las
demand
fuerzas de
that
defensa de Ruanda
M23
a
and the
detener de
Rwanda
manera
Defense Force
inmediata su avance
immediately
y a
cease their
proceder a su
advancement,
retiro
and we
completo,
demand that they
respetando
move to
plenamente
complete
el acuerdo
withdrawal,
del
fully
alto al fuego
respecting the
y los
ceasefire
procesos de
agreement
mediación
and the
en
mediation
curso. Muchas
processes
gracias, señor
underway.
presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Therese Kaikwamba Wagner, State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and Francophonie of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You have the floor, Madame.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Monsieur le Président, distingués membres du
Mr. President,
Conseil,
distinguished members of
permettez-moi au
the
nom du
Council,
gouvernement
on
et du
behalf
peuple de la
of the
République
government and
démocratique du
people
Congo
of the Democratic
d'exprimer
Republic
mes
of Congo,
remerciements
I would like to
pour la
convey my
convocation de cette
thanks
seconde
for
réunion en
convening this
48 heures
second meeting in
sur la
48
situation
hours
sécuritaire dans mon
on the
pays.
security situation in my country.
Je tiens à saluer
I would
l'engagement de la
also like
présidence
to
algérienne du
commend the
Conseil,
commitment of the Algerian
ainsi que les efforts
presidency of the
constants
Council
de ceux qui,
and the
malgré
ongoing
les vents
efforts of
contraires,
those
œuvrent sans
who,
relâche pour la
despite
paix et
strong
la sécurité
headwinds,
internationale.
are striving unfailingly for
Avant de
international
poursuivre,
peace and
permettez-moi de
security.
saluer le sacrifice
Before I
ultime
continue, I would
consenti
like to
au
commend
cours des
the
dernières
ultimate
48 heures par les
sacrifice
soldats
made
de la paix
over
de
the
la
past
MONUSCO
48 hours
et de la
by
SADC
peacekeepers
en République
of
démocratique
MONUSCO
du
and
Congo.
SADC in the
Je rends également
DRC.
hommage au
I would also
courage
like to
et
pay
à la
tribute
résilience
to the
des forces
courage and
armées de la
resilience
République
of the
démocratique du
Congolese
Congo,
armed forces,
ainsi qu'à la mémoire des
and
populations
I'd
civiles
like to pay tribute to
congolaises
those Congolese
victimes
civilians
de l'assaut
who have been
impitoyable
victims
du
of
Rwanda.
the merciless attack by
Nous,
Rwanda.
la République
We, the
démocratique du Congo,
Democratic Republic of Congo,
reconnaissons également
recognize also
les pertes en vie humaine
the
parmi les soldats
losses
rwandais
amongst
au cours
Rwandan
des affrontements,
soldiers during the clashes,
tandis que le Rwanda
whilst
persiste
Rwanda is
obstinément à imposer son faux
obstinately
récit,
insisting
prétendant
on
ne pas mener une
its
guerre en
false
République
narrative,
démocratique
claiming
du
that it
Congo.
is not conducting a
Cette
war in the
position
DRC.
coûte cher aux
This
familles des
stance is
centaines de
very
soldats
costly to the
rwandais
families of
tombés dans cette
hundreds of
guerre
Rwandan
insensée.
soldiers died,
Même si leur
who died
propre
in this
pays
senseless
refuse de les
war.
reconnaître,
Even
de
if
leur
their own
rendre
country
hommage
refuses to
ou d'accorder
recognize
à leurs
them, to
familles
pay
le droit
tribute
de
to
pleurer
them,
leur perte,
or to allow their
nous,
families to
la
the
République
right to
démocratique du Congo,
mourn
savons
their
combien la
losses,
guerre
we, the
dépasse toutes les
Democratic Republic
frontières.
of Congo,
Nous
are well
reconnaissons
aware
que la folie
that
dans
war
laquelle
crosses
Kigali
all
nous a
borders,
entraînés
We
et des
recognize that the
victimes partout.
madness that Kigali has
En
plunged
ce
us
qui concerne le
into
mouvement de
has caused
protestation
victims
observé ce
everywhere.
matin dans la ville
As
de
regards the
Kinshasa, j'aimerais ici rassurer nos
this morning
partenaires
in
que le
Kinshasa, here
gouvernement
I
de
would
la
like to
République
reassure our
démocratique du
partners
Congo
that the
a pris
government
toutes
of
les
the
mesures
DRC
nécessaires
has taken all
pour assurer la
necessary measures
protection des
to
missions
ensure the
diplomatiques
protection
accréditées
of the
en République
accredited
démocratique
diplomatic
du Congo.
missions in the Democratic
Ces
Republic of
incidents,
Congo.
profondément
These
regrettables,
sincerely
ne
regrettable
reflètent en rien
incidents
l'engagement
in no
constant
way
de notre
regret the
pays
constant
envers le
commitment of our
respect du droit
country to the respect
international
for
et des
international
principes
law
qui régissent
and to the
les
principles that
relations
govern
diplomatiques.
diplomatic relations.
Aujourd'hui,
Today,
si nous sommes ici encore une
we
fois,
are
en
here
moins de
once
48 heures,
again,
nous devons
meeting in less
impérativement
than
avoir le courage
48
de nous
hours.
poser cette
So,
question.
we must absolutely be brave
Quel
enough to
impact
ask
concret
ourselves this
la
question.
déclaration de ce
What
Conseil,
specific
quel était
impact did the press
l'impact
statement
concret de la
of
déclaration de
the
ce
Security
Conseil du
Council
26 janvier?
of the 26th of January actually
Monsieur le
have?
Président, à Goma, les forces armées de la
Mr.
République
President, in
démocratique du
Goma,
Congo,
the Congolese
soutenues par
armed
la
forces,
MONUSCO et les
supported
troupes de
by
la SADC,
MONUSCO and
continuent à
SADC troops,
bravoure à combattre.
continue to
Mais
fight
cette défense
courageously.
héroïque
However, this
et déterminée ne
heroic,
saurait masquer
determined
l'ampleur du
defense
drame.
cannot mask
Une fois
the
de plus,
scale
les
of the
soldats de la
tragedy.
paix,
Once again,
dont
the
4 soldats sud-africains de la
peacekeepers,
SAMI-DRC,
including
ont
4
payé
South
le prix
African
ultime
SAMI
de leur
DRC
détermination.
soldiers have paid the
Ces
ultimate
victimes,
price for their
de plus,
determination. These victims
Ces victimes de plus ne
are
sont autres que le
nothing
résultat d'actes
less than the
criminels
result of
constitutifs
criminal acts
de crimes contre
that constitute
l'humanité,
crimes against humanity
de crimes de guerre perpétrés par
and
les
war
RDF en
crimes
toute liberté
perpetrated by the
et sous
RDF
silence de
in
ce
complete
Conseil.
impunity
Mesdames
with
et
the
messieurs,
silence of this
permettez-moi une
council.
parenthèse.
Ladies and
Parmi les
gentlemen,
4
I would
valeureux casques bleus
allow to
sud-africains
engage in a
tombés à
brief
Goma,
aside.
l'un
One of
d'entre
the
eux n'a pas
4
succombé
brave
directement
South
pendant le
African
combat,
blue helmets who
mais il a
died in
succombé à ses
Goma did
blessures.
not die
Ce drame
directly in the
illustre
fighting,
tragiquement la
but he
réalité
succumbed to
actuelle.
his injuries. This
Des vies se
tragedy
perdent dans une ville
illustrates
assiégée,
tragically
privée
the current
d'électricité,
reality.
d'eau,
Lives
de
are
voies
lost in a
d'évacuation.
besieged
Tel est
town,
aujourd'hui le
cut
sort
off
de
from
millions de
electricity,
personnes à Goma,
water and escape
piégées,
routes. This
sans
is the
accès à l'eau,
fate
à
today of millions of
l'électricité,
people in
à la
Goma, trapped
nourriture
without
ou à un
access to
abri
water,
sûr.
electricity,
C'est la tragédie
food or
partagée
safety.
par les
This
citoyens
is a
congolais,
tragedy shared by Congolese
ainsi que par des
citizens
milliers
as
de
well as
soldats
by
de la paix
millions or
et
thousands
d'humanitaires
rather of
pris au piège.
peacekeepers and
Je
humanitarian
remémore les
workers
mots
who are
poignants
trapped.
de la
I would just
représentante
like to
spéciale,
reiterate the poignant
Madame
words
Bintou
of
Keïta, il
the
y a 2
Special
jours.
Representative
Nous
Bintou
sommes piégés.
Keïta 2 days ago. We're
We are
trapped.
trapped. Les dernières 24 heures,
The
plus de
past
100 blessés ont
24
été accueillis
hours
dans
have
les centres
seen
de
more
santé
than
du
100
Comité
patients
international de la
taken to
Croix-Rouge.
the
Et la
ICRC
situation
health
humanitaire
centers, and the
continue à se
humanitarian
dégrader,
situation
avec plus de
continues to
500 000 nouveaux
deteriorate,
déplacés
with
dans
more
la
than
province du Nord et
500,000
du
new
Sud Kivu.
IDPs in the
Pour le
North
mois
and
de
South
janvier
Kivu
uniquement.
provinces in
Les forces
January
de
alone.
défense rwandaises et leurs
The
supplétifs du
Rwanda
M23 ont
Defense
franchi nos
Forces and
frontières,
their stooges
occupé nos
in the
villes et nos
M23
villages,
have
chassé
breached
nos
our borders,
compatriotes de
they've
leurs foyers
occupied our
et
towns and
instauré une
villages,
administration
chased out
parallèle,
our fellow
en
citizens
violation
from
du
their
droit
homes and set up a
international,
parallel
et ce,
administration
en
in
violation
violation of
des
international
positions
law
claires
and in
de ce
violation
Conseil.
of the clear stance of this
Jusqu'à quand
council.
le Rwanda
What more
continuera-t-il
will
d'abuser
Rwanda
votre
do to
respect
continue
et
to
de votre
abuse your
autorité?
respect and your authority?
Quel instrument
What
international doit-il
international
encore violer
instrument
pour que
must
ce
it
Conseil prenne
violate
enfin
for the
les mesures
Council
nécessaires
to
contre
finally
Kigali?
take necessary measures against
De la Charte des
Kigali,
Nations Unies au
from the
droit
United Nations
international
Charter
humanitaire,
to
aux droits de
international
l'homme,
humanitarian law to
en passant
human
par les
rights,
processus de paix
and
de Luanda et
also
de
the
Nairobi.
Luanda and Nairobi
Le
peace
Rwanda a
processes.
prouvé
Rwanda
que vos
has
déclarations
proven
ne
time
lui
and again
importent
that your
guère.
statements mean
Le
absolutely
cessez-le-feu
nothing
du
to
4
it.
août
The
2024
4th
n'a
of
été
August
pour lui qu'une
2024
chimère, et
ceasefire
il s'est
was
pris
just a pipe
d'ignorer vos
dream.
avertissements du 26
And
janvier,
if it is
allant jusqu'à
allowed to
bombarder des hôpitaux et des
ignore
maisons dans la ville
your
de Goma.
warnings of the 26th
Pas
of
plus tard que
January,
dimanche le 26
it
janvier,
has done
le
so.
Rwanda,
It has
pays
now bombed
contributeur en troupes
hospitals
des Nations
and
Unies, par le truchement
homes
de son
in Goma.
représentant,
On
a
the
considéré ce
26th of
Conseil
January, Rwanda,
comme complice de sa
a troop
déstabilisation,
contributing country of the
allant
UN,
jusqu'à associer la
because of
MONUSCO
its
à cette
stubbornness, has
démarche
considered the
invraisemblable.
council
Si cette stratégie a porté des fruits
complicit
par
in
le
its
passé, le
destabilization,
temps de la
and
manipulation
it,
et du
in fact,
mensonge
associated
est
MONUSCO
désormais
with
révolu.
this.
La vie de la population
Whilst this may have borne fruit in the past, the time of manipulation and lies is now over. The lives of civilians deprived of the very means of subsistence for 4 days now in Goma depends on the decisions that you are going to take today. We have not come to tell you about things that you don't know about, but we've come to ask you to be courageous enough to do what is right and to uphold your prerogatives. The lives of civilians cannot be suspended in this machinery
reconnaître la
that just
responsabilité du
doesn't
Rwanda dans les violations multiples de notre souveraineté, ainsi que dans les atrocités qu'il commet, a été insuffisant pour qu'il cesse sa poursuite du conflit. Les victimes ne sont plus seulement congolaises. Le Rwanda a frappé l'Afrique et l'Amérique latine en tuant des militaires sud-africains, malawites et uruguayens venus protéger les civils. Il a frappé ce conseil en tuant des casques bleus de la MONUSCO. N'est-ce pas une preuve suffisante pour vous que lors de chacune des réunions convoquées par ce conseil, la liste des orateurs regorge de pays d'Afrique et d'ailleurs, cherchant à vous pousser à agir? Dimanche, c'était l'Afrique du Sud, le Burundi, l'Uruguay. Aujourd'hui encore, nous sommes rejoints dans un esprit de solidarité par nos frères et sœurs de l'Angola, de l'Afrique du Sud, de l'Uruguay, du Guatemala, du Zimbabwe, du Sénégal, du Burundi. Tous ont répondu, car l'humanité est en jeu. Tous sont venus voir ce que vous allez faire. À quel seuil de catastrophe humanitaire et de violation flagrante de notre territoire devrez-vous enfin agir pour sanctionner les responsables du M23 et les officiers rwandais et leurs complices? Si ce Conseil ne sanctionne pas, l'histoire marquera ce temps comme l'époque de l'impuissance et de l'indifférence du Conseil de sécurité. Le droit de rachat de ce Conseil sur cette crise n'est nulle part ailleurs que dans des actions immédiates. Et déjà, nous voyons venir une manœuvre prévisible. Le Rwanda, qui a délibérément dirigé cette guerre sur le territoire d'un autre État souverain, le nôtre, commence à revendiquer que les combats atteignent son propre sol. Mais que pouvait-il espérer? Une guerre excellente ne connaît pas de frontières. Elle est sale. Elle consume tout sur son passage, les forts comme les faibles. Les 72 dernières heures ne sont qu'un échantillon de la tragédie régionale qui menace. Une tragédie que le peuple congolais connaît depuis des décennies. Une tragédie nationale que ce Conseil peut encore arrêter et une tragédie régionale que ce Conseil peut prévenir par une action résolue et courageuse. Monsieur le Président, certains voudraient faire croire
Some people, sir, would
que
like
l'inaction
to make believe that
est une
inaction
solution
is an
africaine.
African solution.
Nous sommes un pays africain
We are
sous
an
attaque.
African country
Mais cette
under
attaque
attack.
dépasse nos
This
frontières.
attack
Elle
is
est une
going
attaque
beyond
contre
our
le
borders. It is
multilatéralisme,
an attack
contre
on
les principes même des
multilateralism,
Nations Unies,
on the very
contre
principles of
chacun
the
de
United
nous.
Nations,
Laisser
against
cette crise
each
s'enliser
and
sous
every one of
prétexte
us.
qu'elle serait un problème africain,
Allowing this crisis to continue,
nécessitant une solution
stating that
africaine,
it's an
revient à
African
trahir
problem that
l'esprit de
requires an African
solidarité
solution,
internationale qui
betrays the
fonde cette
spirit of
organisation
international solidarity
et
that was the
l'esprit
very
de
bedrock of our
responsabilité de
organization
sécurité
and the spirit
collective
of collective
qui
security
justifie même votre
responsibility
présence comme
that
membre de ce
justifies
Conseil.
your very
Nous
presence as
réitérons
members of
avec
this council.
insistance nos 5
We
demandes urgentes.
reiterate
1.
our
Le
5
retrait
urgent
immédiat
demands.
des troupes
1. The
rwandaises
immediate
et la
withdrawal
cessation
of
des
Rwandan
hostilités.
troops and the
2.
cessation of
La
hostilities.
mise en
2.
place
The
de sanctions
establishment
ciblées
of
contre la chaîne
targeted
de
sanctions
commandement des
against the
RDF
RDF
et
chain of
les
command
décideurs politiques
and
rwandais.
the
3.
Rwandan political
L'imposition
decision
d'un
makers. 3.
embargo
The
sur les
imposition
ressources
of an
naturelles
embargo
déclarées
on
comme rwandaises, en
natural
particulier
resources
le
declared as
coltan et
Rwandan.
l'or. 4. La
4.
révocation du Rwanda
The
en tant que
withdrawal of
contributeur
Rwanda
de
as
troupes
a
aux
troop
Nations Unies.
contributing
On
country
ne
to
peut
the
être à la
UN.
fois
One
agresseur
cannot be
et
the
prétendre
aggressor
jouer un
and
rôle
claim
dans la
to
promotion
play
de la paix.
a role in promoting peace.
5. La
5.
transparence
Total
totale sur les transferts
transparency
d'armes au
on
Rwanda.
arms
Ces
transfers in
transferts doivent
Rwanda.
être
These
arrêtés
transfers must
immédiatement
be
pour
stopped
empêcher qu'ils
immediately
continuent à
to
alimenter
prevent
la
them from
violence
continuing
et
to fuel
l'instabilité.
violence and instability.
Monsieur le Président, nous
Mr.
sommes ici
President,
parce
we're
que
here
c'est ici que
because
le monde doit
here
gérer ses
the
défis.
world
C'est
needs
ici,
to
si ce
resolve
Conseil
its
échoue,
differences and
la
face
rue
its
va s'en
challenges.
charger.
If the
Comme vous le savez
council
très bien,
fails,
la rue n'a pas d'ordre, ni de
then
tempérament.
it is the
Il y a
street
48
that is
heures
going
devant
to
ce
take
Conseil de
charge.
sécurité,
And as
nous
you
avons une
know,
nouvelle
there's
fois
no
attiré
order,
votre attention sur
no
la
calmness
déclaration
on
de
the
guerre du
streets.
Rwanda
48
contre
hours
mon
ago,
pays.
the
Une balle
for
qui
the
frappe dans
Security
le
Council,
cœur
we
ne saurait
once
laisser
again
le
drew your
reste du corps
attention to
indifférent.
the
La
declaration of
République
war
démocratique
of
du
Rwanda
Congo est
against
en
my
guerre et
country.
face à cette agression,
A shot has
l'inaction
been launched
collective
into the
semble
heart,
malheureusement embraser
and
cette
the Democratic
situation
Republic of
jusque
Congo
dans
is
sa
at
capitale.
war.
Je
And
réitère ainsi
collective
encore une fois que le
inaction
gouvernement de la
faced
République
with this,
démocratique du Congo
unfortunately, is just
condamne avec fermeté
spilling
toute
over
attaque contre
into
les
the
missions diplomatiques
capital.
accréditées
Indifference
en
is not an
République
option. The
démocratique du
Council
Congo.
must
Cependant,
not remain
l'indifférence n'est plus une option. Ce
passive.
Conseil ne devrait se
The
permettre de
Council
rester passif,
must
car chaque
not
jour sans réponse
do this because
concrète
each day
fait grandir
without
le
a
prix du
specific
silence. Le
concrete
moment est venu
response
pour ce Conseil
means that
de démontrer
silence
son courage
just
et son
becomes
engagement.
louder. The
L'histoire
time has come for the
retiendra vos
Council
choix.
to demonstrate
Que
its
cette
courage and
Assemblée
its
soit le
commitment.
rempart de la justice
This
et de la
chamber
dignité
needs
humaine.
to
Je vous
be the
remercie.
rampart of justice and human dignity. Thank you very much indeed.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Kaikwamba Wagner for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Rwanda.
Mr. President, thank you for giving me the floor. I would like to once again commend Algeria's able leadership of the Council for the month of January. I'm grateful for your invitation to participate in this important meeting and thank all the member states that spoke before me. I'd like to recognize Ms. Viviane van der Perry, Deputy SRSG. Also recognize Honorable Teresa Kaikwamba Wagner, DRC Minister for Foreign Affairs. I also would like to recognize the participation of the representatives of Angola, Uruguay, Zimbabwe, Burundi, South Africa, Guatemala, and Senegal. Less than 2 days ago, this council gathered to discuss the ongoing situation in the Eastern DRC. Since then, it has rapidly evolved. On 26 January, the M23/AFC rebel group is reported to have taken over the city of Goma. This triggered retreating forces from DRC coalition to attack and shell the Rwandan territory. Rwanda condemns in the strongest terms these attacks on the town of Rubavu in the northern province, which killed 5 people, innocent Rwandan civilians, and left another 35 injured. This indiscriminate shelling is unacceptable war crime, and further proof of the necessity of maintaining Rwanda's defensive posture put in place precisely to prevent this kind of threat. I'd like to recall that these attacks are not the first, but the latest of a long list of provocative actions by the government of the DRC. I'd like to also recall that Rwanda has always shown restraint and sought to engage the DRC in dealing with the root causes of insecurity in the region and along our common border. Rwanda will always stand for peace, as we have the most to lose in the continuation of this conflict. I have always emphasized that Rwanda knows the dividend of peace. We suffered insecurity. Our nation was almost a failed state. So we have worked hard to build peace and to work for peace in the region. So we are strongly committed to peace, peaceful coexistence, and a peaceful region. The coalition of anti-Rwanda forces on our border poses an existential threat to our country, which is not the case for the government of Kinshasa, which feels insulated from whatever happens 2,000 kilometers away. The border of Rwanda is 2,000 kilometers away from Kinshasa. A shell from across in DRC that falls on Rwandan territory falls on a very densely populated villages, and lives are lost. Even one bullet takes a life. Those in Kinshasa will not stay awake when such insecurity happens. So we are very serious when we talk of an existential security threat to Rwanda. Mr. President, the action of this coalition are equally devastating for Congolese. Rwanda is providing humanitarian relief to incoming refugees together with the help of international partners on the ground. A temporary refugee camp has been set up in Rubavu to provide further assistance and shelter to those who are displaced. In addition, many countries have requested our assistance in facilitating the evacuation of their nationals, including European countries of origin of the mercenaries who have been deployed in Eastern DRC. Rwanda also facilitated the transit of MONUSCO and other United Nations personnel through Kigali. Additionally, the hundreds of militia members and FARDC forces we have received have been disarmed and treated with respect and dignity in accordance with international law, and those who are sick are being treated. I would like here also to express Rwanda's condolences to MONUSCO forces that died in this process. On the contrary, we have been dismayed by the reports of attacks and looting of diplomatic missions in Kinshasa, including the Rwandan embassy and several other embassies of members of this council. These thuggish acts, most of which are committed in the passive presence of DRC security forces, are in total violation of international law, especially the 1961 Vienna Convention. Rwanda therefore calls on the DRC to take its diplomatic obligations seriously and hold perpetrators accountable. I'd like to emphasize that those who followed the media, the Rwandan embassy in Kinshasa was among those that was totally burnt down. Mr. President, the deteriorating security situation in the Eastern DRC has only one immediate cause: the obsession by the president of the DRC for a military solution and thirst for regime change in Rwanda. We have said over and over to this council. Indeed, this situation could have been solved a long time ago if President Tshisekedi had demonstrated political will and good faith in finding a lasting solution to this conflict. I would like to recall that President Tshisekedi took the unilateral decision to expel the M23 from the political dialogue under the Nairobi process, as well as East African Community Regional Force, which was deployed by EAC. Yet the EAC Regional Force had led to a ceasefire that held for 6 months, which led the M23 to relinquish 80% of the territory it was holding. This was from March 2023 to September 2023. To fill in this vacuum, the DRC instead decided to replace it with a SADC-led force with a more offensive mandate. These two unilateral decisions by President Tshisekedi have caused the Nairobi process to stall, despite numerous attempts to revive it. Mr. President, Council members, as if frustrating the Nairobi process was not enough, the DRC President repeatedly made inflammatory statements against Rwanda. For instance, in December 2022, in a statement addressed to Rwandan youth, he promised to help them, and I quote his exact words, "Get rid of this diabolic regime in Kigali." Those are the President's words. Moreover, in December 2023, during the last campaign, he doubled down saying that he would bomb Kigali without even setting boots on the ground. These are the exact words of the President of DRC against Rwanda, promising to cause regime change. This echoes a similar statement made on 17th November 2024 in Katanga, when he told military and provisional leadership that if he is given the opportunity to revise the constitution, he would use this new term to overthrow the government in Kigali. Those are clear and constant threats that Rwanda will never take lightly. To implement these threats, President Tshisekedi has mobilized a large coalition which includes the FDLR, genocidal militia, European mercenaries, Wazalendo militias, Burundian armed forces, and some DRC. Council members, consequently, Rwanda calls on all foreign forces deployed in the DRC to withdraw from this coalition only aimed at harming Rwanda. I wish to stress that the international community, including some members sitting in this council, have their fair share of the blame in what is happening today in the DRC, at least to condemn even threats of regime change from one member state to another. You also chose to turn a blind eye on these inflammatory statements and the build-up of the aforementioned military coalition, never once condemning the regime change agenda behind them. Mr. President, Council members, Rwanda remains committed to the Rwanda process, given important milestones that were achieved in the process that was led by President Lorenzo and Angola. And one of the milestones, the adoption of a concept of operations, the CONOPS, of the harmonized plan for the neutralization of the FDLR and lifting Rwanda's defensive forces, and a ceasefire that was agreed and was holding from August 2024. The remaining security issues between Rwanda and the DRC was the AFC M23 question. This question was therefore to be addressed. Unfortunately, in the ministerial meeting of 14th December, the DRC categorically refused any commitment of dialogue with the AFC M23. This then prevented a consensus on a draft peace agreement to be signed the following day by heads of state. Therefore, the only solution was to postpone the summit, as Rwanda is not interested in just a photo op. The heads of state were going to Angola for only one agenda item, to sign an agreement that should have been agreed. Mr. President, Rwanda deploys the intensification of hostilities between the Congolese coalition and the AFC/M23 since the breakdown of the summit. More worrying is the intensive shelling by FDLR, FARDC, from densely populated areas, including IDP camps, towards other populated areas held by AFC and M23. In order to bring about peace in Eastern DRC, Rwanda calls on the following. 1, the full implementation of mainly the neutralization of FDLR, which will lead to the lifting of Rwanda's defensive measures. 2, beyond the CONOPS, Rwanda calls on the withdrawal of foreign troops, part of the Congolese coalition, and we call for European mercenaries to be repatriated and be held accountable. 3, Rwanda believes that MONUSCO can be useful in restoring peace in Eastern DRC by stopping its support to a national army with a regime change mandate, as well as its support to a UN-sanctioned genocidal force and European mercenaries. Rwanda also reiterates its position that it has no hostile intentions against MONUSCO, despite its total failure over the past 26 years. 4, Rwanda believes in the strict adherence to the ceasefire of August 4th, 2024 by all parties, which would allow for a favorable environment for direct dialogue between the DRC and the M23. In this regard, I want to inform you that His Excellency President Kagame spoke with his counterparts from South Africa, His Excellency President Ramaphosa, yesterday. This positive conversation, held in a cordial atmosphere, was productive as it supported the already agreed ceasefire and the resumption of political talks, including with the AFC and M23. I also wish to inform you that tomorrow there will be a virtual ESC summit convened by His Excellency President Ruto on this very question. Before I close, I would like to mention that the DRC government has just claimed that there are Rwandan forces that died in DRC. I want to say that this is categorically not correct. If it was correct, DRC would have provided evidence. I don't think they have that evidence. If they have evidence of any Rwandan soldiers who have died on DRC soil, they should produce that evidence, which I'm sure, I know 100% sure, is not available because that's not true. In closing, Rwanda is committed to the pursuit of a political solution to the conflict. However, we believe that the Rwanda process must not be personalized or taken as an end in itself, but as a tool to resolve security concerns between Rwanda and the DRC. Both the Rwanda and Nairobi process urgently require new impetus in order to achieve sustainable peace and stability for all the countries in our region. We hope that the recent engagements will work towards that goal. I thank you, Council members.
I thank the representative of Rwanda for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Angola. His Excellency Ambassador Amar Benjama, President of United Nations Security Council for the month of January, distinguished members of the Security Council, we welcome the presence of Her Excellency Teresa Kayakwamba Wagner, State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and Francophonie of the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, and Ambassador Ernesto Remusillo, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Rwanda to the United Nations. We thank Mrs. Viviane Van Perre, Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General for Protection and Operations, for her briefing on the latest developments on the ground and for her bravery in keeping high the UN flag under these difficult circumstances. We deplore today's attacks against diplomatic missions in Kinshasa and call on DRC authorities to ensure their protection under the 1961 Vienna Convention on the diplomatic relations. Mr. President, we are at a very critical juncture in the pursuit of lasting peace in the DRC and the normalization of diplomatic relations between the DRC and Rwanda. The M23 has made a significant military advance in North Kivu province, worsening the already fragile security and humanitarian situation in the Eastern DRC. It resulted in the capture of the provincial capital, Goma, despite calls by the United Nations Security Council, the African Union, and the other actors in the international community to halt this military advance. This is a make-or-break moment that requires wisdom and pragmatism from the concerned parties and all relevant stakeholders, including the United Nations, the African Union, and sub-regional organizations. Although His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço, President of the Republic of Angola, African Union champion for peace and reconciliation, facilitator of the normalization of diplomatic relations between DRC and Rwanda, is making every effort to advance the Rwanda process, the security and humanitarian situation in the Eastern DRC has suffered a substantial deterioration in the last few weeks. On 24th January 2025, the Angolan head of state expressed deep concern over the serious deterioration of the peace and security situation in the Eastern DRC. He condemned and denounced the actions of M23 and its supporters, which undermine the progress made under the Rwanda process. He reaffirmed that there is no military solution to the conflict and urged the parties to return immediately to the negotiating table. Due to the rapid deterioration of the situation, members of the enhanced ad hoc verification mechanism and the expanded joint verification mechanism deployed in the city of Goma under the Rwanda process to support the pacification process in the Eastern DRC on Sunday had to be evacuated to Angola. Mr. President, the UN Security Council is the oldest last resort when it comes to maintaining international peace and security. Its mandate is clear and must be respected and upheld. Today, we have one simple and direct message to this Council. The conflict in DRC must cease and the warring parties must return to the negotiating table. The ongoing hostilities in the Eastern DRC have already claimed the lives of thousands of civilians and injured many others. Credible reports indicated that Goma has neither running water nor electricity, thus making living conditions of the population and those living in the IDP camps almost unbearable. In addition, millions of people have fled their homes and they don't know where to go. We demand the immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities, the withdrawal of M23 from the occupied area, as well as the end of its establishment of parallel administration in DRC territory. We call for the full respect of integrity of DRC in accordance with the UN Charter, the international law, and the principles of sovereign equality of all member states. We call on all parties in conflict to fully respect international humanitarian and human rights law, the protection of civilians, IDP camps and medical sites, and the protection of peacekeepers, while noting that attacks on civilians and peacekeepers constitute war crimes. Direct attacks to MONUSCO and some DRC personnel are unacceptable, and those responsible must be held accountable. We urge the signatories of the August 2024 ceasefire agreement to urgently resume dialogue without preconditions. In this context, we call on both parties to return to the Rwanda process under the facilitation of His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço, President of the Republic of Angola. Mr. President, the hardly won gains achieved through the Rwanda process following months of intense negotiation
must be preserved. In his capacity as the African Union champion for peace and reconciliation, mandated to facilitate the mediation between Rwanda and DRC, His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço undertook several initiatives to resolve the difference between the two countries and made substantial progress, including the signing of the DRC-Rwanda ceasefire agreement on the 30th July 2024, which entered into force on 4th August 2024. On 15 December 2024, he convened a summit of the presidents of the two countries, which was subsequently postponed due to disagreement regarding how to address the M23 issue. We reiterate our call for a speedy and unconditional de-escalation of hostilities and genuine and renewed commitment to peace by both sides. Immediate return to the negotiating table is the only way out, since the conflict and security challenges in the Eastern DRC have no military solution. The parties must continue exploring ways to settle the M23 pending issue to create conditions to reschedule the tripartite summit. We encourage the resumption of contacts between His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, former President of the Republic of Kenya, and the facilitator mandate by the East African Community, with the armed groups in DRC, including the M23, under the Nairobi process to address sources of grievances that have led to the current level of insecurity in DRC. The United Nations, the African Union, sub-regional organizations, and leaders in the region must work together in a complementary approach to bring DRC and Rwanda back to the Rwanda process. To conclude, Mr. President, we continue encouraging all parties to avoid any actions or rhetoric that can further escalate tensions, including provocative language and inflammatory public statements, which are counterproductive to the diplomatic efforts to achieve a lasting solution to this conflict that has prevailed for so long. In his quest to advance the Rwanda process, in the last few days, His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço, the President of the Republic of Angola, has been in contact with several African leaders. Today, he spoke with His Excellency Mohamed Ould Ghazouani, President of the Republic of Mauritania and current President of the African Union, and His Excellency Teodoro Obiang Nguema Basogo, President of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea and current President of the Economic Community of Central Africa States, to which DRC and Rwanda are members. Angola reiterates the steadfast commitment of His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço to continue playing his role as the facilitator mandated by the African Union to assist the normalization of diplomatic relations between DRC and Rwanda to achieve peace and security in the Eastern DRC. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Angola for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Uruguay.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradecemos la
We are
información
grateful for the
proporcionada por la señora
information
Vivian
provided by
van
Ms. Vivian van der
der
Pierre,
representante especial adjunta
Deputy
para la
Special
protección y
Representative for
operaciones en la
Protection
misión
and
de
Operations
estabilización de las
in the
Naciones
United
Unidas
Nations
y la
Stabilization
República
Mission in the
Democrática del
Democratic
Congo,
Republic of the
MONUSCO,
Congo,
así como la
MONUSCO.
convocatoria de
We're
esta
also
reunión
grateful to
informativa por parte de la
the
presidencia.
President of Algeria for convening this briefing.
Destacamos el
We
rol del
underscore
Consejo
the
de Seguridad en
important
este
role
tema
played
que
by
ha
the Security
impulsado
Council on this issue.
un alto al fuego
Their
en
work
línea
has
con el
prompted
comunicado
a
emitido por
ceasefire
sus
in line with
miembros
the
en la
press
noche del
statement
domingo
issued
26
by
de
the
enero,
Council members
cuyo
on the
contenido
26th of January. We
con cuyo
fully
contenido coincidimos
agree with
totalmente.
the content of that press statement.
Agradecemos en ese
Moreover,
sentido
we're
a los miembros del Consejo
grateful
por
to
su
Council
receptividad
members for their
y
willingness
rapidez
to
para
address
atender el
this
tema,
issue and for
pero
their
lamentablemente
expeditious work.
la
However,
situación en el terreno
unfortunately, the
continúa
situation
siendo
on the ground continues to be critical.
No obstante,
However,
haberse anunciado precisamente un cese al fuego,
a ceasefire
los
has
combates
been
continúan
announced. However, fighting
y
continues.
Por lo que debemos continuar
Consequently, we must continue,
todos nosotros y especial el Consejo, dándole
as
la
the
máxima
Council, and
prioridad
indeed all of us should continue to
al
attach
cese
the
de
utmost
hostilidades.
importance to the cessation of
Solo esto
hostilities. It is
permitiría
only
volver
that
a las
that will make
negociaciones
it possible
para
to
arribar
resume
a una
to
solución
negotiations to
política
ultimately
duradera
achieve
en
a
el marco de los
lasting
procesos
political
de paz de
solution within
Ruanda
the
y Angola.
framework of the Luanda and Nairobi peace
Con relación a la
processes.
ofensiva del M23,
Regarding
se ha
the
generado una
M23
situación
offensive,
extremadamente
an
crítica
incredibly critical
para las
situation has
poblaciones de la
been
zona,
produced for
al
civilians in
tiempo
the
que se ha
region.
puesto en
At
riesgo
the
la
same
seguridad
time, the
de los
security
contingentes
of
que
MONUSCO
integran la
personnel has been
En ese sentido, se
imperiled.
valora lo
In view of
expresado por
that
el
fact,
secretario
we
general,
value what was said by the
quien ha
Secretary General.
señalado que estos
He
ataques
has
pueden
stated that these
constituir
attacks
crímenes de
may
guerra que deben
constitute
ser
war crimes
investigados
which must be
y cuyos
investigated.
responsables deben
Perpetrators
rendirse.
must be held accountable.
Ante esta situación,
In the
pedimos su
face of
condena
the
y que el Consejo
aforementioned
de Seguridad
situation,
tome
we
todas
condemn
la
it,
condena
and
de
we
estas
ask you to do
acciones
the same.
y
The
que el
Security
Consejo de
Council must
Seguridad
take all necessary
tome todas las medidas
measures
necesarias
to
para lograr que la ofensiva del
ensure
M23
that
y
the
aquellos que la
M23
apoyan se detengan
offensive
y
and
se
that waged by
consolide el
those
cese
supporting the
de las
M23
hostilidades
is ceased,
con pleno respeto a la
and
integridad de las
the
fuerzas
Council
de
should
paz.
act to ensure that there is full
En
cessation
cuanto
of
al desarrollo de la
hostilities
crisis en el terreno,
and
reconocemos
full respect
positivamente
for peacekeeping
las orientaciones
forces.
que el Comando
We
de la
value
MONUSCO
the
ha definido
guidelines
para
that the
impulsar la seguridad
MONUSCO
de las
command
poblaciones
has issued
civiles
to
y de los
protect the
contingentes de las
security of
fuerzas de paz
civilians and
ante esta ofensiva.
contingents in the
Sin
peacekeeping
perjuicio de
forces in
ello,
the face of the
expresamos la
M23
necesidad de
offensive.
directivas claras
Without prejudice
para,
to the above, we
para los
express that
procedimientos a
there is a
seguir,
need for
así
clear
como el
instructions
máximo
regarding
apoyo a los
procedures to be
contingentes
followed,
nacionales
and
en
utmost
materia
support must be given
logística
to
y de
national
suministros
contingents in
para
terms of
que puedan hacer
logistics and
frente a las
supplies
crisis
so that they're
humanitarias
able to
que
address the
afectan a la
humanitarian
población local
crisis
y las
affecting the local
consecuencias de la entrega de
population, as
armas
well
por las
as
tropas
the consequences of the weapons
congoleñas,
handover by
así
Congolese
como su
troops.
atención médica.
Medical care for
Uruguay
all must be guaranteed.
reitera
We
su
reiterate
compromiso una
our
vez más
commitment
con la paz
once
en la
again
República
to
Democrática
peace
del
in the
Congo y su apoyo
DRC
a la
and our
MONUSCO en estos
support for
momentos
MONUSCO
críticos.
at this
Muchas
critical
gracias.
juncture. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Uruguay for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of the Southern African Development Community, SADC, allow me to express our gratitude to you for convening this urgent meeting to address the escalating situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo. That we meet again on this issue following the session on Sunday, the 26th of January, underscores the gravity of the unfolding crisis. We welcome the briefing by Deputy Special Representative Vivian van der Peer, and we also recognize the presence of the Foreign Minister of the DRC, Her Excellency Therese Wagner. Mr. President, Zimbabwe, as does SADC, remains unwavering in its adherence to the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, particularly the peaceful settlement of disputes and the commitment to respecting the territorial integrity and political independence of states. These principles are more critical than ever as we confront the deepening crisis in the Eastern DRC, particularly in Goma. Mr. President, the chairman of SADC, His Excellency President Emmerson Mnangagwa, issued a statement yesterday in which he conveyed his profound concern over the deteriorating security and humanitarian conditions in the Eastern DRC, brought about by offensive operations of the M23 rebel group and its allies. He condemns unequivocally the cowardly attacks on the UN and SADC peacekeepers, some of whom have paid the ultimate price in the pursuit of peace. On behalf of SADC, President Mnangagwa extended heartfelt condolences to the families of the fallen peacekeepers and wished them, those injured, a speedy and full recovery. Mr. President, the persistent instability in the Eastern DRC, exacerbated by the actions of the M23 rebel group, represents a grave threat to peace and security in the region. The occupation of Goma and other areas by armed groups undermines the sovereignty of the DRC and the stability of the Great Lakes region as a whole. We commend all efforts deployed at the local, regional, and international levels in addressing this crisis. However, we stress that sustainable peace can only be achieved through dialogue, strengthened governance, and robust international support. To this end, we urge the United Nations and the Security Council to, 1, provide enhanced support for the protection of civilians and the stabilization of conflict-affected areas. 2, ensure accountability for violations of international humanitarian law and human rights, including the attacks on peacekeepers and civilians. 3, address the root causes of the conflict, including the illicit exploitation of natural resources, which continues to fuel instability. 4, facilitate the movement of humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, as SADC chair, Zimbabwe reaffirms its commitment to collaborating with the African Union, the United Nations, and all stakeholders to achieve lasting peace in the DRC. The current crisis highlights the urgent need to reform the international peace and security architecture, including the Security Council, to better respond to the unique challenges facing Africa. Moreover, we reiterate the importance of eliminating the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons, which perpetuates instability across the continent. Mr. President, in conclusion, SADC stands in full solidarity with the people and government of the Democratic Republic of Congo. We call on all stakeholders to act decisively to prevent further escalation, safeguard lives, and restore peace and stability. This is a moment for collective action, a moment to demonstrate our shared commitment to unity, peace, and sustainable development. Zimbabwe and SADC stand ready to contribute meaningfully to these efforts, and we look forward to working with our partners to forge a peaceful and prosperous future for the DRC, the SADC region, and beyond. To that end, the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe and current chairperson of SADC has called for an extraordinary summit scheduled for the 30th of January 2025 to discuss this matter. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Zimbabwe for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Burundi.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
ma délégation se
my
réjouit de
delegation is
participer une nouvelle fois à ce
delighted
briefing sur la
to participate again in this
détérioration de la
briefing on the
situation
worsening security
sécuritaire en République
situation
démocratique du
in the
Congo,
Democratic Republic of
marquée
the
par les
Congo.
récents
These
développements dans la
situations
ville de Goma.
characterized by recent
Elle
developments
félicite
in the city
la
of Goma.
présidence
We
algérienne du
thank
Conseil
the
pour avoir convoqué
Algerian
cette réunion dans
presidency
un
of the
délai aussi
council for
court.
having convened this meeting
Je
at
salue la
such
présence de son Excellence
short
Madame la
notice.
ministre des
I
Affaires
welcome Her
étrangères de la
Excellency, the
RDC,
Minister for
son
Foreign
Excellence
Affairs of the
Thérèse
DRC,
Kaikwamba
Her
Wagner,
Excellency Thérèse
et me
Kaikwamba
réjouis du
Wagner,
briefing fait
and
par Madame
I
Viviane Van de
hail the
Peer,
briefing delivered by Ms.
représentante
Viviane Van de
spéciale
Peer,
adjointe chargée de la
Deputy
protection des
Special
opérations à la
Representative for
MONUSCO.
Protection and Operations in
Avant d'entamer
MONUSCO.
mon propos,
At the
le gouvernement du
outset,
Burundi présente ses condoléances aux
I
soldats
wish, as
qui
the
ont perdu
government of
leur vie
Burundi,
durant les
to
récents affrontements durant les
convey our
48 dernières
condolences
heures.
to the loved ones of those that have lost their
Monsieur le
lives
Président,
over the last 48 hours
pour la deuxième fois,
in the DRC.
en l'espace de
Mr.
48
President, for the
heures,
second
nous
time
sommes
in
réunis
48
pour
hours,
constater
we are
avec une
gathered
grande amertume
to
que la
note with
situation
bitter
à l'est
regret
de la
that the
RDC
situation
s'est
in Eastern
gravement
DRC
dégradée.
has worsened to
Le moment
an
est
alarming
venu pour que les
degree.
paroles
The time has
cèdent
come
la place
for
à des
words
actes
to give way
concrets.
to tangible action.
Comme nous l'avons affirmé il y a
As
2
we
jours,
stated 2
le
days
Burundi
ago,
soutient fermement le respect
Burundi
de la coexistence
staunchly
pacifique entre les
supports the
nations et
principle
rejette
of the
catégoriquement
peaceful
les guerres par
coexistence of
procuration.
nations, and we categorically
Monsieur le
reject
Président,
proxy wars.
depuis près
Mr.
de 3
President,
décennies,
over almost 3
l'Est de la
decades,
RDC
Eastern
est devenu
DRC
le
has
théâtre de
become
massacres
the
insoutenables,
theatre
de
of
conflits
untenable
armés,
massacres,
d'une
a
rare
theatre of
violence alimentée par des intérêts
armed
étrangers
conflicts,
exacerbant les tensions
exceptional in their
locales
violence.
et
These conflicts
sapant
have been
les
fueled by
efforts
foreign
de paix.
interests and
Chaque
undermine
jour, des violations
peace
graves des
efforts
droits
as
humains
well as
sont
fanning the
observées
flames of local
et les
tensions.
victimes
Every day,
se
grave
comptent
violations
désormais
of human rights
en
are
millions.
noted, and the number of victims now
Les
stands
récents
in the
développements à
millions.
Goma témoignent d'un
Recent
potentiel
developments in
embrasement
Goma bear
régional.
witness to a potential
Si aucune
regional
action concrète
conflagration
n'est
if
prise
no tangible
aujourd'hui
action is
pour
taken
condamner
today
les
to condemn
responsables
those
et bloquer leurs
responsible
actions,
and thwart their
nous
plans,
risquons de
we
devenir
risk
les témoins
becoming
d'une
the
catastrophe
witnesses
et
of a
l'histoire nous
disaster,
tiendra
and
directement
history will
responsables.
hold us directly
À ce
accountable.
jour,
To
le
date,
Burundi se félicite
Burundi
des accords
has commended
bilatéraux
bilateral
avec la
agreements
RDC
reached with
en matière de
DRC
coopération
in
militaire
terms
pour la
of
sécurité
military
des frontières
cooperation
communes.
to ensure the
Et
security of our
si tu me
common
permets
borders.
de placer une petite parenthèse,
Allow me just to issue
le
an
Burundi
aside at
ne
this
fait pas
juncture.
partie d'une
Burundi is
quelconque
not
coalition.
part of any coalition.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
depuis des années,
for years
les
now,
Nations Unies, à
the
travers le
United
travail
Nations, through the
inestimable du
invaluable
groupe d'experts de la
work of the
RDC, ont
DRC group of
documenté avec
experts,
précision les dynamiques de ce
rigorously
conflit.
documented the dynamics
Des
of this
rapports
conflict.
multiples ont été
Myriad
présentés dans cette
reports have
salle,
been presented
soulignant
before this chamber,
l'implication d'acteurs
emphasizing the involvement of
extérieurs
external
connus
actors
pour soutenir
known to
les groupes armés
support
locaux.
local
Les
armed
violations
groups.
flagrantes des droits de l'homme
We've had
et le
reports of
pillage
flagrant
systématique des
violations of
ressources
human rights and the
naturelles
systematic
de la
pillaging
RDC.
of the DRC's natural
Combien de rapports
resources.
supplémentaires
more
faut-il
reports do we
avant
need
que la
to
communauté
hear before
internationale
the
et en
international
particulier le
community and in
Conseil de
particular
sécurité
the
prennent ses
Security
responsabilités?
Council shoulders its responsibilities?
Il y a 48 heures,
48 hours
au cours
ago,
de notre
during
intervention,
our address,
nous nous sommes interrogés
we
sur le
asked
silence
ourselves
assourdissant
questions about the
du Conseil de
deafening
sécurité
silence
alors que
of
des
the
milliers de
Security
vies
Council
sont
at a
tragiquement
time when
perdues chaque
thousands
jour.
of lives are being
Où
tragically
est
lost
la
every
communauté
day. Where is
internationale?
the international
Où est le
community?
Conseil de
Where is
sécurité
the
qui se
Security
montre si
Council, which
actif
is so
dans
ready
d'autres
to
conflits?
act in other conflicts?
Devons-nous interpréter ce
Should we
silence comme une
interpret this
sensibilité
silence
sélective?
as bias?
Comme l'a dit une fois
As
Martin Luther King
Martin
Jr.,
Luther King Jr. once said,
à la fin,
in the end,
nous nous souviendrons
we will
non pas
remember
des mots de
not
nos ennemis,
the words of our
mais des
enemies,
silences
but the
de nos amis.
silence of our friends.
Ne soyons pas les amis
Let us
silencieux.
not be
Soyons
those
du côté de
silent
la Charte
friends.
des
Let
Nations
us
Unies pour
stand
sauver
on the
l'ordre
side of the
institué à
United
San Francisco
Nations Charter
en juin
to save the
1945.
order established in San Francisco
Monsieur le
in June
Président,
1945.
ce conflit
Mr.
dure depuis
President,
des
this
décennies
conflict
et
has
pourtant
raged on
aucune
for
résolution n'a
decades,
condamné le
and yet
Rwanda,
no
auteur
resolution
de
has
violations
condemned
flagrantes des
Rwanda as
principes
the
de la souveraineté
perpetrator of the
nationale
flagrant
et de
violations of the
l'intégrité
principles of
territoriale de la
national sovereignty
RDC.
and territorial
Le
integrity
Rwanda ne
of the
nie même pas
DRC.
sa
Rwanda
présence sur
doesn't
le
even
terrain
deny
ni
its
son
presence
soutien
on the ground,
au
nor
M23,
its support
comme l'ont
for the
souligné plus des
M23.
trois quarts des
That
membres
has
du
been
Conseil
emphasized by
lors
more
de la
than
dernière réunion.
3/4 of the council
L'intégrité du
members
territoire de la RDC ne
during the
peut être
last meeting held.
compromise et les
The
incursions armées, les
territorial
ingérences
integrity of the
étrangères,
DRC
le
cannot be
pillage systématique
imperiled.
de ses ressources
Armed
naturelles
incursions,
et les violations répétées de ses
the
frontières doivent
pillaging
cesser
of its natural
immédiatement.
resources,
Au regard de la
and
situation
repeated
sécuritaire et
border
humanitaire,
violations must
le Burundi
immediately
s'inscrit
stop.
toujours du
Given
côté
the
du plein
security and
respect du droit
humanitarian
international
situation,
et du
Burundi
droit
will always
international
champion full
humanitaire.
respect for international
À cet
law and
effet,
IHL. With that
le
in
Burundi
mind,
condamne
Burundi
les
condemns
violations flagrantes du
flagrant
droit
violations of
international
international
et du
law
droit
and
international
international
humanitaire.
humanitarian law.
Appelle
We
à
call
une
for an
cessation
immediate
immédiate des
cessation of
hostilités à l'est
hostilities
de la
in
RDC,
Eastern DRC
à garantir
and
que ce territoire ne devienne plus
for
un
us to
terrain de
ensure that this
confrontation
territory
indirecte
does not become
entre
an arena
acteurs
for
régionaux
indirect
et
confrontation
internationaux.
between regional and
Soutient les
international
efforts des
stakeholders.
processus
We
de
support
Luanda et
efforts
de
made
Nairobi
within the
en
Luanda and
exigeant le
Nairobi
respect des engagements
processes
pris
by
par toutes les parties.
demanding that all parties uphold
Exige
commitments
le
made.
retrait des
We
forces
demand the
rwandaises de la
withdrawal of
RDC
Rwandan
et
forces
réitère
from the
son
DRC, and
attachement
we
au respect
reiterate
de la
our
souveraineté
commitment
de la
to
République
the
démocratique du Congo,
sovereignty of the
son
DRC being
intégrité
upheld, as well
territoriale,
as our
son
commitment to its
indépendance
territorial
politique
integrity,
et
its
son
political
droit à se
independence,
défendre
and its
contre
right to
toute
defend itself
agression
against any
extérieure.
external act of aggression.
Recommande de
We
poursuivre les
recommend
soutiens
that
aux
support
populations
continue
civiles
to be
et
provided
déplacées
to
de guerre
civilians and
afin de
those
subvenir
displaced by
à leurs
this
besoins
war
de base
in
avec une
order
attention
to ensure
particulière
that we meet
aux
their
femmes
basic
et
needs.
aux enfants.
Particular care must be
Pour
given to
conclure,
women and children.
et
To
comme nous l'avons
conclude,
déjà
as we
exprimé,
have already
le
stated,
Conseil de
the
sécurité devrait
Security
être
Council
attentif
must
aux
pay heed
revendications légitimes
to the
du
legitimate
peuple et
demands
du
of
gouvernement
the
congolais.
government and
Je vous
people
remercie.
of the DRC. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Burundi for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, thank you for convening a second meeting within just a few days of the current tenuous situation in the Eastern DRC. The situation on the ground remains dangerously fluid as M23 continues its offensive campaign in North and South Kivu. We thank the Deputy Special Representative, Ms. Viviane van der Peer, for her briefing. And again, we wish to recognize the presence of Minister Therese Kayikwamba-Wagner in the chamber. Since the last meeting of the Council on the situation in the Eastern DRC, 4 additional South African peacekeepers lost their lives in the continuing conflict in Goma. On 27th January 2025, M23 launched several mortar bombs aimed at Goma airport, which landed in the base of the South African troops, killing 3 soldiers and injuring some troops. A 4th soldier, as Minister said earlier, succumbed to his injuries sustained during the weekend attacks. This illustrates that the M23 is well-resourced and would have acquired such resources through means that are against the sanctions imposed by this Council. It is a contradiction in terms that a major UN peacekeeping troop contributing country could provide resources to an illegal armed group that is conducting offensives against peacekeepers, civilians, and key infrastructure, thereby undermining the mandate of this Council. That must be addressed with utmost urgency. As we stated at the last meeting of the Council a few days ago, the future of UN peacekeeping and its credibility is at stake if we are to tolerate such violations without any ramifications. The Security Council must speak with one voice and act in unison to stop the carnage unfolding in the Eastern DRC. Unfortunately, a press statement of the Security Council, while sending an important political message, has proven to be insufficient in the current situation. Consequently, South Africa would like to highlight the following issues. Firstly, the UN needs to, as a matter of urgency, provide additional support to MONUSCO in order to reinforce operational positions. This is to ensure that MONUSCO can fulfill its primary mandate to protect civilians. This support will also assist to ensure that no further peacekeepers' lives are lost. Similarly, a stronger consideration must be made to bolster the support that MONUSCO provides to the South African Development Community Mission in the DRC, SAMI DRC. Both missions, have the primary responsibility of protecting civilians and key civilian infrastructure. They are instrumental as long as armed groups remain active in the Eastern DRC. Secondly, we remain concerned about the worsening humanitarian situation with millions of people in need of humanitarian assistance. There is a need to ensure that appropriate conditions are created for humanitarian aid to reach people in need across Eastern DRC. All parties to the conflict must uphold international humanitarian law and human rights law. Thirdly, we reiterate our call for the resumption of negotiations under the Rwanda process. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa held a telephone call with President Kagame of Rwanda yesterday to discuss recent developments in the Eastern DRC and the escalation in fighting that has resulted in the deaths of many peacekeepers, including South Africans. The two heads of states agreed on the urgent need for a ceasefire and the resumption of the talks by all parties to the conflict. Accordingly, South Africa recognizes the significant strides made by President João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço of Angola in facilitating peaceful resolution of the tensions between the DRC and Rwanda. We urge parties to recommit to these talks and address all outstanding issues amicably to allow the region to return to peace and the restoration of the political rapprochement and good neighborliness. This includes both sides addressing their relations with illegal armed groups and the withdrawal of the Rwanda Defense Forces from the DRC. We thus look forward to the much-anticipated East African Community Extraordinary Summit likely to take place in the coming days, with the participation of both President Tshisekedi and President Kagame. Lastly, the Council needs to underline the importance of preventative measures to avoid the recurrence of the cyclical conflict in the Eastern DRC. It is well known that the genesis of this conflict is primarily the illegal exploitation of the Congolese natural resources. International and regional efforts, including those initiated by the International Conference on the Great Lakes region to address the problem of the resource curse in the region, must be operationalized and supported. As I conclude, Mr. President, I wish to remind Council members that South Africa has suffered many casualties in this conflict. The reason we never hesitate in supporting peace efforts, even at excessive cost, is because we are a product of international solidarity at whose center was the United Nations. Therefore, the ultimate sacrifice of South African peacekeepers in the promoting peace and security in the Great Lakes region should not be in vain. Our plea is for this Council to always protect those who value, safeguard, and execute the mandates adopted in this chamber, and also hold into account those who violate the decisions of this very Council. Failure to do so can only undermine the credibility of and delegitimize the authority of this Council and the United Nations as a whole. We trust that all members of this Council and the international community can support measures towards establishing a ceasefire, encouraging dialogue, and promoting efforts towards peace and stability in the whole country and the Eastern DRC in particular. Thank you.
I thank the representative of South Africa for this statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guatemala.
Señor Presidente del Consejo de Seguridad,
President of
miembros
the
de
Security
este
Council,
Consejo,
members of the
señora
Council,
Ministra de Relaciones
Minister
Exteriores,
for Foreign
Cooperación
Affairs,
Internacional
International
y Francofonía de la
Cooperation
República
and
Democrática
Francophony of the
del
Democratic
Congo,
Republic of the
Thérèse
Congo,
Kayibanda
Thérèse
Wagner.
Kayibanda Wagner.
Dada la urgencia de la
Given the
situación en la
urgent
República
nature of the
Democrática
situation in the
del
Democratic
Congo
Republic of the Congo
y su desarrollo,
and the way it is
agradecemos
playing
la
out, we're
convocatoria de la
grateful
reunión urgente del
for the
pasado
convening of
26
the
de enero
urgent meeting held
y
on the
nuevamente
26th of
el día de hoy.
January, and once again for the meeting
Agradecemos
convened
también
today.
la información
We're also
recibida de la
grateful for the
señora Viviane van de
information
Peer,
furnished by Ms.
representante
Viviane van de
especial
Peer,
adjunta para
Deputy Special
protección
Representative
y
for
operaciones
Protection and
de la
Operations
MONUSCO,
in MONUSCO.
así como los esfuerzos
And we're
por mantener
grateful for
informados
efforts made
oportunamente
to
a los
keep
países
contributing
de tropas.
countries abreast of developments in a timely
Señor presidente,
fashion.
el Gobierno
Mr.
de Guatemala
President, the
desea
government of
manifestar
Guatemala
su
wishes
gran
to
preocupación
express
por el
its
agravamiento
grave
de las
concern at the
hostilidades en el
ratcheting up
este
of hostilities
de la
in
República Democrática
Eastern
del Congo.
DRC.
Condenamos en
We
los términos
condemn in
más
the
enérgicos
strongest
la
terms
ofensiva
the offensive
lanzada por el
launched
movimiento
by
23 de marzo
M23 in
de las últimas
recent
semanas,
weeks, as
su
well
expansión a
as
Kivu
their
del Norte
expansion into
y la
North
toma
Kivu
de la
and the
ciudad de
taking
Goma.
of Goma.
Esta situación
This
tiene un efecto
situation is
devastador
having a
para la población
devastating
civil,
impact on the
que al
civilian
momento ha
population.
generado el desplazamiento de
To
cerca
date,
de
it
3
has
millones
prompted the
de personas
displacement of
solo
at
en
least
Kivu
3
del Norte.
million people in North Kivu alone.
Como país
As
contribuyente
a
de
true
tropas,
contributing
Guatemala
country,
reitera su
Guatemala
apoyo
reiterates
inquebrantable a los
its tireless
esfuerzos de
support
paz en
for
curso,
peace efforts
a
underway
los procesos de
for
Luanda y
Luanda and
Nairobi,
Nairobi processes,
dirigidos
both
a
designed
reducir
to
las
abate
tensiones en la
tensions
República
in the
Democrática
Democratic
del
Republic
Congo.
of the Congo.
Lamentamos el
We
fallecimiento de
deplore
cascos
the
azules de
deaths of blue
diferentes
helmets
nacionalidades,
from various
incluyendo de
countries,
Uruguay,
including Uruguay,
Sudáfrica
South Africa,
y
and
Malawi,
Malawi.
y esperamos la
And
pronta
we wish
recuperación de
a
los
speedy
heridos,
recovery to
incluyendo
those
dos
wounded,
oficiales
including 2
guatemaltecos.
Guatemalan officials.
Reafirmamos
We
nuestro apoyo al
reaffirm our
mandato de la
support
MONUSCO de
for
proteger a los
MONUSCO's mandate
civiles
that
y
is to protect
condenamos
civilians, and
enérgicamente
we
las
condemn
acciones
in the
de los
strongest
grupos
terms the
armados que
actions
pongan en
of armed
peligro
groups
la
that are
seguridad de los
imperiling the
cascos azules de las
security of
Naciones
UN Blue
Unidas y el
helmets
personal
and civilian
civil.
personnel.
Su protección
Their
y
protection
seguridad
and immediate
inmediata debe
security
ser
must be
garantizada,
guaranteed,
así como la provisión de los
as
suministros
must the
necesarios
provision of
para el
supplies
desempeño
necessary
de su misión.
for the mission's mandate to be discharged.
Guatemala expresa
Guatemala
que los
wishes
ataques
to
contra
state
cascos
that
azules de
attacks
Naciones
against UN
Unidas
Blue
pueden
helmets may
constituir crímenes
constitute
de
war
guerra
crimes
conforme al derecho
pursuant to
internacional,
international law.
en particular
In
teniendo en
particular,
cuenta
bearing
que la
in
misión
mind
prioritaria
that the
cumplida
primary mission
por el contingente nacional
of our
es la
national
protección de
troops is
civiles
to
ante
protect
peligro
civilians
inminente de
in the face
violencia
of
física,
imminent danger
la
of
cual es
physical
cumplida
violence.
de manera
That mandate
efectiva
is discharged
e imparcial.
both effectively and
Esperamos
impartially.
que el
We
Consejo
hope
de
that the
Seguridad
Security
tome de
Council
manera
will
unívoca
take
y con carácter urgente
unequivocal
medidas
action
contundentes
as a matter of
condenando los
urgency.
ataques
This
contra los
action
cascos
must be
azules que cada vez
categorical in
están
terms of
más
condemning
en riesgo.
attacks against blue helmets that are
Señor
increasingly
Presidente,
at risk.
exhortamos a
Mr.
todos los
President, we
actores
urge all
a que respeten la
stakeholders to
soberanía
respect
y la integridad
the sovereignty and
territorial de la
territorial
República
integrity of the
Democrática
Democratic
del
Republic of the
Congo
Congo
y pongan
and
fin a
to put
todas
an
las
end
formas
to
de
all
apoyo
forms of support
a los
being
grupos
extended
armados,
to armed groups,
ya sean
be these
congoleños
Congolese
o
or
extranjeros.
foreign.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
I thank the representative of Guatemala for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Senegal.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Monsieur le
President.
Président, le Sénégal
Mr.
voudrait
President,
remercier
Senegal
l'Algérie
would like
pour
to
la
thank
tenue de
Algeria
cette importante
for
réunion
convening this important
et saluer
meeting
l'exposé
and
de
commend
Madame
the
Viviane
briefing
Van
of
de
Ms.
Peer.
Viviane Van de Peer.
Ma délégation se
My
félicite également de la
delegation
présence de
also
Son Excellence
would like
Madame
to
Thérèse
welcome
Wagner,
Her
ministre des Affaires
Excellency
étrangères de la
Thérèse
République
Wagner,
démocratique du
Minister of
Congo.
Foreign Affairs
À
International
l'entente de
Cooperation
son
of
intervention,
the DRC.
ma délégation s'incline
From
devant
the
la
outset,
mémoire
my
de tous les
delegation
casques
pays
bleus
tribute to
et
all those
soldats
blue
tombés au
helmets
champ d'honneur.
and soldiers who've
Ainsi, le
died
Sénégal
in the line of
présente
duty.
ses plus sincères
Senegal would like
condoléances à
to
l'Afrique du
present
Sud,
its most sincere
au Malawi
condolences to South
et à
Africa,
l'Uruguay en
Malawi, and
particulier.
Uruguay in
Nous
particular.
exprimons notre solidarité
We
agissante
stand in
à la République
solidarity
démocratique du Congo
with
et à l'endroit
the
de
people
tout
of
le
the
personnel
DRC
onusien sur
and
place
all UN
qui
staff
continue
on the ground to
d'apporter
continue to
assistance et
lend
réconfort aux
assistance and
personnes dans le
comfort
besoin,
to
et
people
ce,
in need
à bien
and
des égards,
in
au
many
péril
ways
de leur
at
vie.
risk of their lives.
Aussi, ma délégation
My
a une pensée
delegation
émue pour les victimes
would like to
civiles de
extend
part et
its
d'autre
thoughts
et
and
souhaite
prayers
un
for
prompt établissement aux
civilians
blessés,
and
dont
would like
4
to
éléments
wish a
sénégalais de la mission.
speedy recovery for
Mon pays réitère son
those
attachement à la reddition
injured.
des
My
comptes pour tous
delegation
les
would like
crimes
to
commis
reiterate
à
its
l'égard
commitment
du
to
personnel des
accountability
Nations
for all
Unies,
crimes
comme
committed against
recommandé par
UN
la
staff,
résolution
as stipulated in
2589
Resolution
2021.
2589 of
Monsieur le Président,
2021. Mr. President,
comme vous pouvez l'imaginer,
as
le
you can
Sénégal,
imagine,
avec
Senegal,
459
with
éléments
its
à la MONUSCO,
459
est gravement
sons
préoccupé
and
par la
daughters
situation
in
des casques
MONUSCO,
bleus
is
sur
seriously
place.
concerned by the
En
situation
effet,
regarding
c'est au
the
Congo,
blue
en
helmets
1960,
on the ground.
soit 4 mois
In
seulement après son
Congo,
indépendance, que
indeed,
le
in
Sénégal
August
s'était engagé dans l'ONU.
1960, just 4
C'est
months
dire que mon
after
pays est
it
resté
acceded to
activement
its
engagé
independence,
dans les efforts
Senegal
onusiens pour apporter la paix
engaged in the UN operation in Congo, so my country has remained actively engaged in UN efforts to bring peace to the region. In these difficult times, we would reiterate to all parties the obligations incumbent upon them to protect civilians, in particular women and children, and peacekeepers and humanitarian staff, and also to reiterate the necessary respect for human rights. Like the previous speakers, Senegal condemns in the strongest possible terms the resumption of fighting in North Kivu, in particular in Goma, in flagrant violation of the ceasefire concluded on the 30th of July 2024. The uptick in clashes constitutes a serious attack on the security of the region and of the continent. We cannot allow the situation to deteriorate into a global crisis that will have an impact on hundreds of thousands of civilian lives and in a region that has already been so sorely tested. This is why my delegation joins itself with the call of the A3 Plus of the Security Council, as well as that of the Secretary General, calling for the immediate cessation of the M23 offensive and its territorial expansion. The only option to this conflict is political in nature. Senegal would urge, therefore, all the parties to honour their commitments as the part of the ceasefire and to give diplomatic negotiations a chance under the auspices of the African and in good faith to strive for peace and regional stability. My country therefore reiterates its unfailing support for the African mediation efforts between the DRC and Rwanda that are currently being undertaken as part of the Rwanda process. Senegal also calls for ongoing consultations as part of the Nairobi process to settle the ongoing issue of armed groups, including the M23, and to pave the way to bring peace and stability to the region. Mr. President, my delegation does not wish to conclude without calling upon the Council to learn the correct lessons from this conflict and the impact it's having on MONUSCO. What we learn is that there have been many difficulties encountered, but the staff have been very resilient in accomplishing their mission. It is important for the Council to provide this mission with necessary resources to carry out its tasks, to contribute to the protection of civilians in the area where it's deployed, and to support stabilization of institutions in the DRC and the main reforms in the area of governance and security. This necessarily involves the guarantee of an environment propitious for its deployment, the involvement of all stakeholders, and better coordination with regional forces present in the DRC in terms of taking charge of the threat posed by armed groups. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Senegal for the statement. Her Excellency, Ms. Therese Kaikwamba Wagner, State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and Francophonie of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give her the floor.
Mr. President, thank you for the floor. Members of the Council, first of all, I would like to note that for the first time in our meetings, Rwanda did extend condolences for the fallen peacekeepers. However, I would like to rectify something. The peacekeepers did not die in a process. The peacekeepers were killed. Second of all, SADC forces deployment through SAMI DRC were not deployed unilaterally by the DRC, but rather with a mandate from the AU, an organization Rwanda is a part of, even if its behavior in the DRC clearly flaunts its principles. Third, the M23 excluded itself from the Nairobi process by renewing attacks against the FARDC. The government of the DRC has nonetheless expressed its willingness to re-include the M23 in the Nairobi process. We reject Rwanda's obsession and attempts to elevate the M23 to the level of an interlocutor deemed fit to sit at the same table as a legitimate government. 30 years down the line, we have never stooped to the level of expecting and demanding from Rwanda to talk to its brothers and sisters, the FDLR, who are still in our country. We have not stooped to that level. Fourth, on regime change, we will remind the Rwandan delegation that the M23 and the AFC has repeatedly expressed its intent to march in Kinshasa, the very M23 Rwanda forces are backing right now. There is a subtlety that should not go amiss between words and actions. Rwanda's actions, side by side with the M23, are actions seeking to overthrow a legitimately established government. On the Luanda and Nairobi processes, we will remind the Rwandan representative that the DRC never left the negotiating table. It was Rwanda that did not show up on the 15th. It was Rwanda that did not come when President Lorenzo invited us. And President Kenyatta was also present. President Tshisekedi honored his commitment. In the past weeks, we have seen efforts, calls from this council, from our partners, from our friends, urging us all to renew our efforts within the Luanda process. The DRC never left the table. It is up to Rwanda to come back to the table. I would also like to remind the Council that in this very session, the government of the DRC, through my own statement, condemned all attacks against diplomatic missions in the DRC. We do this in our concern to abide by and respect international law. However, we have yet to hear Rwanda explain to us what its efforts have been to abide by international law and to respond to the violations it has been found guilty of in the DRC. Violations of the Charter, violations of international humanitarian law, violations of international human rights law. Members of the Council, I would like to close with what has brought us back here in less than 48 hours. Rwanda's outright contempt for this Council and its declaration that it will not, for the Council and the Council's declaration, and its demonstration that it is in the deluded belief that there is a Rwandan exception when it comes to international law. But what has also brought us here is the Council's choice 2 days ago to opt for words and not for actions. This Council is not unable to take actions. In fact, it is uniquely equipped to take actions. Hence, the question that remains at the end of this meeting is whether this Council is unwilling to act. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Kayikwamba Wagner for her statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.